The barbed end of the poker plunged into her skull with a wet, sickening thud, a sound that will forever be the crescendo of my personal hell. I felt the bone give way, a brittle crunch like dry leaves underfoot, and then the tool eased into the soft, yielding folds of her mind. A tiny, choked sob escaped her lips as she pitched forward, a puppet with severed strings, landing face down with another gut-wrenching impact. Her small hand, still clutched in a miniature fist, lay still. The world, already a kaleidoscope of terror, fractured into 1,000 shards of agony. My Maya, my little girl. It all started earlier that day, under a sun that promised nothing but peace. The heat was a living thing that Friday, pressing down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer above the manicured lawns of Elmwood Drive. Late August, the kind of afternoon that felt like the last gasp of true summer, sweet and heavy with the scent of cut grass and blooming hydrangeas. My wife, Jessica, and our daughter, Maya, were off on one of their girls' days, a ritual of shopping for sparkly things and gossiping over overpriced coffees. That left me and Kyle, our boy, to forge our own masculine adventure. We were strolling back from the park, Kyle's hand a warm, damp anchor in mine. 8 years old, just like his twin sister, and still at that age where the idea of a boys' day with Dad was less a chore and more a grand expedition. The park had been good to us, scraped knees, a victorious capture of the swings, and a tactical retreat from a particularly aggressive patch of dandelions. My worn leather jacket, a relic of a life I hadn't yet started running from, was slung over my shoulder. Too warm for the sun, but a comforting weight nonetheless. I remember absently checking my old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick I hadn't even registered yet, more for the comfort of its familiar weight than any actual need to track time. It was a perfect, unremarkable day, the kind you catalog in your mind as safe. Then the jingle cut through the lazy afternoon. It was that jingle, the one etched into the collective subconscious of every kid who'd ever chased a truck down a suburban street. A tinny, off-key rendition of "Pop Goes the Weasel," piped out from tinny, roof-mounted loudspeakers. Most parents, myself included, considered it a nuisance, a siren song for sugar-crazed demons in miniature. But on this particular Friday, something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the slightly distorted quality of the speakers. It was a subtle disharmony, a sour note lingering beneath the cheerful melody, like a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Kyle's head snapped up, his blue eyes wide and luminous as twin summer skies, fixed on the sound. A little tug of blonde hair fell across his forehead as he looked up at me, his face a silent, pleading question. "Sure, bud," I said, a grin already forming. How could I say no? This was exactly the kind of simple, sun-drenched memory you build a childhood on. A moment I would later replay a million times, searching for the crack in the facade, the moment I should have known better. He bounced with excitement, a blur of motion as he pounded off down the sidewalk. His laughter, bright and clear, mingled with the jingle as the boxy white truck, emblazoned with the faded, cheerful logo of Mr. Frosty's ice cream, turned the corner and trundled slowly up our quiet suburban tract. It was a standard-issue vehicle, no different from 1,000 others. Yet even from this distance, something in my gut tightened. The sun seemed to dim, just perceptibly, as its shadow stretched over the street. The truck crunched to a stop beside Kyle, maybe 25 feet from where I stood, suddenly rooted to the spot. My son, a small, vibrant figure, took his place beneath the awning, his head tilted back, eyes scanning the luridly colored menu plastered on the side. I couldn't see the driver. The window, I noted, was heavily tinted, an opaque shield against the afternoon light. But someone had to be in there, because the serving window scraped open. The sound clawed at my ears, raw and unpleasantly loud for the distance. The awful shriek of abused metal grinding on rusty rollers, like fingernails on a chalkboard, amplified 100 times. It was a sound that didn't belong on a sunny afternoon. It belonged in a nightmare, in the echoing halls of an abandoned factory. The interior of the truck was drenched in shadow, not just ordinary shadow, but a deep, inky blackness that seemed to defy the slant of afternoon sunlight, battling it from outside. It was a void, a hungry mouth, sucking in all light and warmth. I should have known then. I should have turned, grabbed Kyle, and run. Every fiber of my being, every primitive instinct, was screaming. The air raid siren in my head was a full-throated howl, demanding immediate flight. The chill that had started as a nibble at my bones was now a bone-deep cold, radiating from the truck, seeping into the pavement, biting at my exposed skin. It felt like the sudden, profound drop in temperature before a storm. Only this storm was not of nature's making. It was a cold that spoke of death, of something ancient and terrible. Up until that moment, I had been ambling, leisurely motoring up the sidewalk without a care in the world, letting Kyle have his moment. But that chill, that profound wrongness, triggered something visceral. For the first time in my life, I reacted without thought, without my usual measured caution. I fell into a sprint. It was a full tilt, blind, panicked rush down the sidewalk. My chest squeezed tight. My swollen, thundering heart fought my lungs for space in a ribcage that felt too tiny, too full of drying cement. The houses, the respectable, upper-middle-class family homes with their white trim and manicured lawns, blurred into a colorful, meaningless streak as I bombed up the sidewalk. My legs scissored beneath me, burning with effort. My arms pumped like pistons. My cold breath whip-cracked through my shrinking lungs, tasting metallic and acrid. I don't think Kyle heard me. I didn't yell. Couldn't. My throat was full of gluey breath. Nothing more. There would be no sound coming from me, other than the thin, reedy whistle of air sawing through my lungs. Maybe the slap thud of my sneakers hammering the pavement, but I doubt even that registered over the cheerful, distorted jingle. He sensed something was wrong, though, sensed it with that preternatural ability afforded only to children, the one that tells them when mom and dad are fighting even when they can't hear it from across the house. He turned, his blonde hair whipping in the wind, his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, like two little oceans cooling off a face of sunshine, fixed on me. His expression shifted from childish excitement to a dawning, innocent fear. And then the ice cream man took him. A mass of black, segmented spider legs exploded out of the darkness of the truck's interior. They moved with impossible speed, a seething, tangled horror of hairy, jointed feelers. They didn't just grab, they sucked him through the window like shrink wrap through a vacuum cleaner. With a wet, pliant sound, Kyle snapped back. A rag doll into the writhing tangle. He didn't have time to scream. There was a whoosh of air from his mouth, a desperate, truncated gasp, as the spider legs tore him back by the stomach. He blipped through the window, his head smacking the top of the frame with a sickening crack before lolling like a dead thing on his neck as he disappeared into the suffocating darkness of the truck. Now I did scream, a raw, guttural wail that tore from my throat. Kyle's name ripped out on a thread of pure agony. I ran harder, the world tilting and swaying underfoot like I was barreling up the deck of a ship in stormy waters. My vision blurred, doubled, snapped together, then shot into excruciating focus as I lurched up to the ice cream truck, my hand outstretched as if I could pluck him back from the maw that had swallowed him. Then I froze. My lungs snapped shut like rubber bands, and a thin whistle of air escaped my nostrils. My whole body crawled with a cold, greasy dread. My heart was galloping through my rib cage like a mile-wide herd of bison, each beat a painful, desperate drum. The inside of the truck was impossible. It was too big. It was a dystopian nightmare. Like the truck was a portal, a shimmering, distorted gateway to the killing floor of a massive slaughterhouse. The rotten husks of cattle chutes, slick with something dark and glistening, and blood-stained linoleum textured a sprawling, incomprehensible plant like the fossils of a forgotten, monstrous industry. But it wasn't forgotten. It was horrifyingly, brutally active. It was dark, soaked in shadow, but I could see them, pale, fragile shapes, limping along the chutes, shuffling towards a doom I couldn't comprehend. Their faces were slack, eyes glazed and vacant, like broken, violated dolls. The livestock was children, hundreds of them, caked in their own filth, their small, broken bodies shuffling along the chutes, while hulking figures in blood-stained aprons and USGI cold weather masks butchered them alive. There were no screams. That was the worst part, the part that burrowed into my soul and set up residence. It was deadly silent. Just the weak shuffle of small feet, a horrifying counterpoint to the wet tear of curved knives opening throats, the syrupy slap of blood hitting the floor. The dead were hoisted, ankle up, on a conveyor system, like at a dry cleaner's, an absurd, sickening detail, which zipped them off through a darkened portal into the unknown, a hot trail of blood still spraying from their severed necks. It was a factory of despair, an assembly line of shattered innocence. The smell was cloying, metallic, like a butcher shop mixed with something sweet and rotten. Perhaps the lingering scent of unconsumed ice cream, or the sickly sweet odor of fear and waste. I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. My stomach churned with nausea, a hot rush of vomit threatening to erupt. I tasted bile at the back of my throat, the bitter tang of pure terror. Then something grabbed out at me. A pale, small hand, sticky and cold, reached through the opening. I jumped back with a strangled cry, a new wave of horror washing over me. It was Kyle. His head was pitched at a wrong, impossible angle on his broken neck. His eyes were dead, vacant, no longer the warm ocean puddles they had been, but two icy marbles that could freeze a soul with a single glance. But there was still a piece of him buried somewhere in there, a flicker of his essence, a final, desperate act of love, because he said a single word in a voice I would never, ever hear again, a voice raspy and thin, imbued with a terrible, knowing sorrow. "Run!" Then, with an almost deliberate motion, he slammed closed the serving window. As it cracked shut, I saw the massive spider legs encircle him from behind, like interlacing fingers. A final, suffocating embrace. The hairy legs covered his mouth, his eyes. They tore him backwards, with a wet, tearing sound, and sent him into the slaughter line, gone for good. The truck's engine rumbled to life, a low, predatory growl. The ice cream jingle, impossibly cheerful, crackled from its roof-mounted speaker as it pulled away. It growled up the street, turned the corner with a deceptive slowness, and disappeared from view, carrying off my only son. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sob tearing through me. I stood there, swaying, the sun suddenly too bright, the air too still, the jingle echoing in the vast, empty space where my heart had been. I'll never forget the way my wife screamed when she came home, the sheer, visceral devastation of it. The police lights, hellish blue and red, painting our suburban house in shades of emergency, detectives in cheap suits, their faces grim, asking questions I couldn't answer. When I told her Kyle was gone, her face crumpled. She dropped to her knees on our perfectly manicured lawn and howled, a primal sound of loss that would haunt my dreams for years. I pulled Maya close, hugging her trembling body, burying my face in her soft, blonde curls. The warmth of her a desperate comfort in the rapidly chilling world. We cried together, a small island of grief in an ocean of incomprehension. The first 24 hours are the most important in abduction cases, one of the detectives had said, his voice flat, professional. But I knew better, knew what I'd seen, knew my boy was gone for good, which, as it turned out, wasn't entirely the case. But I knew it all the same on that afternoon Kyle stopped for ice cream. A quiet certainty, cold and absolute, settled in my gut. I didn't tell the detectives what I had seen. How could I? How could I explain the impossible dimensions, the spider-legged horrors, the silent slaughterhouse? They would have thought I was spinning tall tales, trying to disabuse my guilty conscience of the fact that I had, in their eyes, somehow failed to protect my son. They would have slammed me into an interrogation cell as the lead suspect, a father unraveling under the weight of grief and delusion. So I lied, told them a Mr. Frosty's ice cream truck had taken him. They put out a statewide APB. They found nothing. Of course they didn't. Jessica and I didn't sleep that night. Her face was puffy, eyes red and swollen from endless tears. Maya, despite being only 8, was smart as hell, quick to catch on. She understood what was happening, the gaping void that had swallowed her brother. She also seemed to sense that Mom and Dad needed to be alone, so she put herself to bed without much fuss, a small, brave figure disappearing into the darkness of her room. I felt numb, my whole body cold, a physical manifestation of the lie I was living. It was a sick lie, giving Jessica any hope. I knew deep down, in the furthest pits of my stomach, that our son was dead. All those children were dead. Blindly shuffled up the murder chute to those massive things in bloody aprons, with their gore-drenched knives and their horrific USGI cold weather masks. Jessica said something, her voice hoarse, barely audible. I looked up, pulling myself from the abyss of my thoughts. What? She blew snot into a crumpled tissue, her movements sluggish, mechanical. Kyle's out there. We should be looking for him, trying to find that truck. She cut me an accusing glare, her eyes still burning despite the tears. She blamed me. I knew she did. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't fair. But I knew. The police said I stopped mid-sentence. A pale shape, gowned in her PJ onesie, clutching her pink blanket like a shield, had appeared in the doorway of the living room. Maya. Honey, I murmured, rising and sweeping Maya into my arms. Her small body was trembling, cold despite the summer night. She looked at me, her eyes wide. Wide with a fear that wasn't just the shock of a child who'd seen her parents' grief. It was something else, something deeper. Fear of me? No. I knew at that instant what she was afraid of. He's home, Daddy, she said, her voice a thin whisper that sliced through the suffocating silence. Kyle's home. The thing at the back door wasn't our son. It looked like Kyle. It walked like him. A dragging, clumsy gait that was just off enough to register as deeply wrong. But it wasn't him. Not really. It was pale, drenched in mud that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. Its eyes, those once warm, ocean blue puddles, were cold and dead. 2 icy marbles that could freeze you with a single, knowing look. They were fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. Jessica sobbed, a sound of relief and profound anguish mingling, and wrapped the thing in an embrace. It didn't hug back. Its small, stiff arms hung limply at its sides. Those 2 cold eyes, locked on mine, held a knowing smile that was just beginning to break its face. Why'd you do it, Daddy? It said as we led it into the living room, a question delivered in a voice that was too flat, too devoid of inflection for a child. A chill, more profound than the one from the truck, settled over me. I could feel Maya's body tense against mine, knew something bad was about to happen. What? My wife asked, her voice trembling, looking from me to the thing she believed was our son. Why'd you try to kill me? Try to kill me, huh, Daddy? Why? I thought you loved me. Dad, I thought you... Its head reared back impossibly far on its neck, a movement that defied human anatomy, bone and muscle stretching and distorting with a wet crackle. Its mouth curved into a dark, perfect O. A throaty, gurgling sound, wet and thick, escaped its throat. Its eyes rolled back into their sockets, showing only the whites, stark against the pale, mud-streaked skin. It was no longer Kyle. It was a caricature, a grotesque puppet. Jessica looked at me, eyes wide with a dawning terror, then back at the abomination that wore her son's face. I don't think she realized she had started backing up. I don't think I did it either. We retreated into the living room, the Kyle thing bearing down on us, forcing us back, a predator stalking its prey. Maya had started to sob into my shirt, her tears warm and salty, dampening my chest, a stark contrast to the growing cold in the room. The O of the Kyle thing's mouth continued to expand, drawing further and further back, skin stretching taut, muscles straining. Only this time its lips didn't move, and the voice, deeper, warped, like the words of a demon from the mouth of the possessed, came hissing out of its throat, a chorus of gravel and slime. "Why, Dad, why'd you fucking do it? You like killing little kids? Dad? Want to kill Maya? Want to see her pigtails wrapped in brain? Stop!" My voice was weak, thin, a pathetic rasp against the guttural roar from the thing's throat. The thing chuckled, a vile, wet sound, as Kyle's mouth continued pulling back. Its lips were coated in a glistening bile, the smell faintly acrid, metallic. Its teeth were brown and jagged, like broken porcelain shards. Too many of them, too sharp, a predator's grin. Jessica's head was on a swivel between our son and me, her eyes darting, wide with a horror that was finally, unequivocally, sinking in. Her legs hit the couch, and gravity planted her ass on the cushion with a surprised, "Oh!" It was lost in the hoarse voice that had hijacked my son's mouth. "Want to bash her little head in? Hammer it until it crumples and all those little girl thoughts and feelings come spilling out." The corners of my son's mouth tore. Rivulets of blood, dark and viscous, sledded down its throat, leaving glistening trails on the pale skin. Its mouth continued to pull back, like its head was splitting open on a hinge, bone grinding against bone. "Make him stop, Dad," Maya moaned, her voice muffled against my chest, her tiny body trembling violently. I couldn't speak. My voice was lost, swallowed by the terror and the rising gorge in my throat. I fished for it, my Adam's apple bobbing, but it wouldn't come. My hands, clammy and useless, felt for something, anything, to defend us. The Kyle thing's mouth split wider, wider, bone and tendons snapping and crackling with wet, tearing sounds. Its lower face was soaked in blood and bile, a gruesome, impossible maw. "Want to be a butcher, Dad?" The voice within my son chuckled, a cold, mocking sound that resonated deep in my chest. Hack through gristle and vein and the stretch of pink flesh connecting tiny heads to tiny bodies? Feel the warm rush of blood over your hands? Feel your knife scrape bone as they drain? I saw its throat distend and undulate, like there was a knot of fingers trying to claw their way out, something alive and writhing beneath the skin. Want to watch the light bleed from their eyes as their life bleeds from their throat? Want to, Dad? Want to? The words were laced with a perverse glee, a sick invitation. Then the Kyle thing's head tore back with a final, gruesome snap, its cheeks ripping, its mouth forced open in an awful, hellish grin. And the massive, hairy spider legs, thicker now, pulsating, exploded from its throat. A black, writhing tide of segmented limbs, each tipped with a barbed, chitinous claw. My wife started to scream, a terrified, choked sound that was instantly cut off. One of the spider legs, thick as my arm, lashed out, a blur of black against the pale walls, and batted her across the face. Her head snapped around with a sickening crack, an unnatural angle, and she pitched forward with as much life in her bones as a sack of grain, landing in a heap on the couch, unmoving. That galvanized me into motion. A red haze descended, grief, rage, and a primal, animalistic need to protect the last piece of my world. I tossed Maya onto the couch, her small body landing with a soft thump, and lunged for the rack of fireplace tools. My fingers closed around the heavy, cold metal of the poker, its barbed end a promising weapon against the impossible horror unfolding before me. The spider legs crackled and snapped, a writhing, flickering net of tendrils erupting from my son's broken mouth. They danced, a macabre ballet of death, their chitinous tips glistening. Maya was shrieking now, a pure, unadulterated sound of terror. Her face was crumpled, eyes wide and streaming tears, fixed on the monstrous thing that used to be her brother. The spider legs lunged for her, shot forward for her delicate little form, a black wave of intent. I tore the poker free of the fire rack and whipped around, using my forward momentum, the weight of the poker, and every ounce of desperate strength I could muster to bring the instrument down. I aimed for the pulsing mass, for the thing that had taken my family. Only I missed. Oh God, how I missed. Maya had lunged away from the spider thing trying to kill her, had lunged right into the arc of my swing, a desperate, childish movement for safety that sealed her doom. The barbed end of the poker hit the center of her skull and went burrowing into her brain. I felt bones snap like glass. I felt the poker ease into the spongy folds of her mind. She fell like she was a puppet, and I had cut her strings. A little sob escaped as she planted face down with a sickening thud. Her hand made a tiny fist, and then she died. The Kyle thing began to roar with laughter, a sound that chilled me to my core, somehow more horrifying than the screams of the dead children in the truck. It turned on me, its impossible mouth still split in that grotesque grin, the spider legs flickering and pulsing, snapping in all directions like 10 of those dealership tube men, a chaotic, murderous dance. "You like killing kids, Dad? You like?" Then the thing let out a surprised gasp, a sound of genuine shock that was utterly out of place. The spider legs snapped erect, like soldiers at attention, and then, as if a switch had been flipped, the animation drained from my son's face. The impossible grin vanished. The dead eyes stared blankly. The end of the poker, which I'd wrenched free of Maya's broken mind, was now jutting from my son's left eye. His ocean blue eyeball had deflated, a thin run of pus and something else, something metallic and dark, ran down his cheek. In my blind, animalistic rage, after Maya fell, I had swung again, wildly, desperately, and this time, by some twist of cruel fate, I had connected. Then the tendril sucked back into its mouth with a final, throaty gurgle, a wet, collapsing sound, and my son pitched forward, a limp, dead weight, as dead as the rest of my family. I stood there, the poker still clutched in my hand, my entire body rigid. I was misted in my children's blood, the sticky warmth of it a testament to the horrors I had just witnessed and inflicted. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ragged, painful gasps of my own breath. I looked at Maya, a tiny, crumpled heap, at Jessica, still and broken on the couch, and at Kyle, a pale, lifeless shell. And then, the dam broke. I dropped the poker with a clatter that echoed in the sudden vastness of the house, and I started to cry, a raw, animal sound of utter despair. I can hear the sirens now, a distant wail growing steadily closer. The police will be here soon. They'll see the scene, the blood, the bodies, and they'll come to their conclusions. I know what they'll say. I'm writing this now, sitting here amidst the wreckage of my life, a silent warning, a desperate, pleading cry for others to listen. I'm not looking for absolution. There is no absolution for this. I'm broken. A man ruined by an ice cream truck that rode in on a hot summer day. I'm sure you'll see my name bolded in the paper, conjoined to some variation of the term family annihilator. But it wasn't me, not entirely. I bear blame, God, how I do. The choices I made, the desperate swings, the accidental blow. My failure to protect them, to comprehend the true, insidious nature of the horror, that guilt will haunt me until my last breath. But it wasn't all me. It was that thing, that truck, that impossible, monstrous portal. It reached into my life, into my home, and pulled everything I held dear into its sickening maw. And I, the ordinary man, was left to pick up the pieces, to be the last haunted survivor. Please don't make the same mistakes I did. Be suspicious of the mundane. Be wary of the ordinary. And if your kids ask for ice cream, buy them a tub of the store-bought stuff. It's just as good, safer. Everything is safer than that jingle. This is how it begins. This is how you get marked. I'm marked. I know it now. I can feel the chill of it, an invisible brand. And I'll be running from it for the rest of my life. Total characters, 97801. The crimson spray against the cheap floral wallpaper was the first thing that registered, a grotesque counterpoint to the saccharine sweet laughter still echoing in my head. Then the scream, not human, not quite, but a raw, tearing sound ripped from Johnny's throat, followed by a high-pitched, gleeful shriek that resonated with something ancient and vile. My eyes, already wide, tracked the glint of steel, then the sickening, wet thud as something vital gave way. A butcher knife, the kind you buy for tenderloin, now severing more than just meat. It was cutting ties. Funny how a man trying to keep his head down, just trying to survive another day, always finds himself knee-deep in somebody else's nightmare. This particular one had started subtly enough, a slow, discordant hum beneath the veneer of ordinary strangeness, like a bad radio signal you almost managed to ignore. My gig was a temporary night maintenance position at the old Sterling Arms, a place that smelled permanently of stale coffee, forgotten aspirations, and a faint metallic tang I couldn't quite place. 80 years of chipped paint and desperate tenants. Perfect for a guy like me. Always on the move, looking for somewhere to lie low until the next strange thing found me. The pay was enough to keep Buster in kibble and me in cheap coffee, and the hours were mercifully empty. Mostly as Johnny was one of the tenants on the third floor. Unit 3B. I'd seen him around, always in the mornings, lugging a duffel bag stuffed with what looked like clown props. Rainbow wigs, oversized shoes, a perpetually deflated balloon animal. My first thought, predictably cynical, was, great. Another one. The circus must be in town. I had an inherent distrust of anyone who chose to make a living by eliciting forced laughter from children, clowns especially. There was something unsettling about the painted smiles, the artificial joy. It felt like a mask, and I'd seen too many masks in my life, often hiding something far uglier than a frown. This was the kind of neighborhood where a lot of people wore masks, physical or otherwise, just to get through the day. The Sterling Arms was full of them. Johnny, when he wasn't Mr. Giggles, was a quiet man. Too quiet. Maybe. His smiles were nervous. Quick things that vanished before they truly formed, like a breath on a cold window pane. He'd nod a quick greeting if we passed in the hall, eyes darting, never quite meeting mine. My old leather jacket, the one that had seen more miles and more shit than most people saw in a lifetime, was a constant, familiar weight on my shoulders. I'd run my thumb over the worn leather of the lapel, a nervous habit. It was a shield, a comfort. I was good at observing people, not just for danger, but for the subtle tells, the cracks in the facade. Johnny had a lot of cracks. He looked perpetually exhausted, a quality I understood. But there was something else, too, a haunted look, perhaps, or a look of internal struggle. It made him stand out from the merely world-weary. It made him interesting, which was usually bad news for me. Interesting things always found a way to drag me in. I'd catch glimpses of him from my little maintenance nook in the basement, through the building's ancient, glitchy security feeds, the grainy black and white image of him returning late, sometimes with a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Even in the cool night air, always alone, he seemed to shrink as he walked down the hall, as if trying to fold himself into the shadows. I'd checked my old analog wristwatch. A useless tick, really. More for the comfort of the cold metal against my skin than for the time. It was a constant in a world of variables. Then came the lockdown. The world outside went quiet. The Sterling Arms didn't. The sounds from Unit 3B started shortly after. At first, it was just muffled voices, arguments. Sometimes, I'd be checking a leaky pipe on the floor below, or replacing a flickering bulb on the third floor, and I'd hear it, hushed, intense conversations. Johnny lived alone, or so I'd assumed, but the voices, low and conspiratorial, suggested otherwise. My gut tightened. This was the kind of detail that snagged on my observational wiring, setting off tiny, silent alarms. It reminded me of the thin walls of that old house upstate, the one where Mitch had changed, the way danger had been present, unseen, already inside, festering, before it finally erupted, the quiet, insidious kind of horror. My hand instinctively went to my watch, fiddling with the crown. Tick-tock, Leo, another mess. I told myself to ignore it. It wasn't my business. People had private lives, private conversations. Maybe he had a new girlfriend, or maybe he just talked to himself. I knew a thing or two about talking to myself. It was a coping mechanism, right? But the cadence of these voices, the back and forth, the distinct inflections, it sounded like two separate people. And the intensity. It wasn't a friendly chat, it was an argument, sometimes even a struggle. I heard scrapes, thuds, things falling, then dead silence. My heart would pound a little harder, a little faster, a familiar drumbeat of dread. One afternoon, the noises escalated, a frantic shuffling, a sharp crack, like wood splintering, then a muffled grunt. My reluctant conscience, that little spark of misplaced responsibility I constantly cursed, began to prickle. It was the same pull that had dragged me onto that mountain pass, listening to a dead man's impossible whisper. The same instinct that made me wonder if that charming bastard Ethan was truly what he seemed. Damn my fatal flaw. I hated this about myself. I was a survivor, a runner, not a do-gooder. But the sounds, they were too desperate. I found myself walking down the third-floor hallway, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet of the deserted building. The air grew colder as I approached 3B, a subtle drop that was entirely too familiar, a signature chill that heralded the unnatural. I knocked, a sharp, insistent rap against the hollow core door. Silence. Then, a hurried scramble from within, followed by a distinct thud, the sound of something heavy being slammed shut. A case? My mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. Johnny, clowns, cases, props. Maybe he was just packing something away. A normal explanation. I craved a normal explanation. The door opened a crack, revealing Johnny's face, streaked with something that looked suspiciously like a faint red smudge near his temple. His smile was short, nervous, and showed far too many teeth. It didn't reach his eyes. "Leo," he said, his voice a little strained. "Everything all right?" "Heard some noise," I grunted, my eyes flicking past his shoulder, trying to peer into the dimness of his apartment. I caught a glimpse of rudimentary furniture, a jumble of what looked like gag props, and something else, something dark and low to the ground. My heart did a slow, uneasy lurch. Sounded like a scuffle. "Just an old colleague," Johnny replied, his eyes darting away. He cracked the knuckles on his right hand, then flexed his wrist, shaking it out like he was trying to dislodge an ache. It was a nervous gesture, the kind you see from people hiding something or fighting something. "Oh," I pressed, leaning a little closer, trying to project a casual curiosity I definitely didn't feel. "Which one? I thought you work mostly solo these days." "Dan," he said quickly, almost too quickly. His gaze flickered to my face, then away again. "You wouldn't know him. Moved to Australia years ago." "Australia, right." The vagueness of his answer, the quick deflection, the subtle way he blocked my view into the room, it left an unpleasant gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. My gut, conditioned by years of encountering the truly monstrous, things that wore human skin, things that pretended to be friends, things that whispered from inside walls, screamed wrongness. But I was tired, so tired, and I was clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was an actual normal person with actual normal problems. I muttered something about making sure everything was okay and retreated. Cowardice, maybe, or just exhaustion, but the feeling of unease persisted, a low-frequency hum under the skin. A few months later, the city started to rumble back to life. I heard Johnny was struggling for bookings, which wasn't surprising. A lot of people were. My own work was steady enough, checking fire alarms, fixing leaky faucets, dealing with tenant complaints that mostly involved phantom noises. The irony wasn't lost on me. Johnny's restless sleep patterns, which I'd noticed on the security feed, late returns, lights on through the night, worsened. Sometimes, I'd be in the laundry room below his unit, and I could hear him, muffled thuds, sharp exclamations, sometimes a strange, high-pitched giggle that was too shrill to be Johnny's own. It was a cold dread that settled in, the kind that reminded me of that bizarre pig creature I'd encountered, the way it had stalked me, hunted me. The world was full of predators, and some of them didn't even have to show their faces. One evening, I was down in the basement, sharpening the old Zwilling chef's knife I'd found abandoned in a tenant's move-out pile. It was a good blade, a sturdy piece of German steel, and it felt solid and real in my hand, a welcome weight. I'd always liked cooking, a small, quiet pleasure I rarely indulged in anymore. Just the act of creating something simple and nourishing. Johnny walked in, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed. He looked utterly drained. "Is that a new knife?" he asked, his tone accusatory, his voice a little hoarse. He didn't look at the blade itself, but rather at my hand, and then up at my face, as if expecting an admission of guilt. I held the polished blade up to the dim basement light. "Nah, found it. Someone left it behind. Got it nice and sharp, though." "How much did it cost?" he pressed, his voice rising slightly, an edge of something desperate in it. His eyes darted around the room, settling on the workbench, the tools, the grimy walls, as if searching for something. "Nothing," I said, shrugging. "It was free." "Why?" Johnny rubbed his temples with the heel of his hand. "Clowning it's in a slump. Leo, I haven't had a booking in weeks. My finances are stretched thin. Every penny counts." "Maybe if you found something else for a bit," I mumbled, turning back to the whetstone, trying to ignore the prickle of irritation. It wasn't my place to give financial advice. I just wanted to finish sharpening my knife. "Oh, so you want me to quit clowning?" he snapped, his voice cracking, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Is that it? Throw away everything I've worked for?" I sighed. "Nobody said you had to quit. Johnny, just maybe a steady gig for a little while to..." "Steady? What? A real job?" His voice was sharp, laced with an offended fury that seemed disproportionate to my words. He was clenching his fists, his knuckles white. I bit back a sarcastic comment. This was a man at the end of his rope, or maybe already past it. I didn't need to be the one to push him further. I just wanted him to leave so I could finish my goddamn knife. He turned abruptly, heading for the door. "Oh, are you going to tell them what I said?" he muttered almost to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. "Who?" I asked, my blood suddenly running cold. Them. The voices. The colleague from Australia. My gut twisted. He crossed the threshold, then spun around, his finger stabbing the air. "You're crazy, Leo. Just crazy." His eyes, wide and almost manic, seemed to be looking through me, past me, at something I couldn't see. "Then who are you talking to all the time, Johnny?" I pushed, my own voice surprisingly calm, despite the tightening knot of dread in my stomach. "Why all the smoke and daggers? I hear you. Man, I hear the arguments, the sounds of things breaking." Johnny exhaled, a long, shuddering sigh. His shoulders sagged. He looked utterly defeated. "There are parts of my life you'll never understand. Leo, the clown world's complicated. It's got its own rules, its own people." My eyes narrowed. People, singular, not plural. That slip confirmed it. It wasn't a person, and the way he said its own people, it wasn't human people. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. The memory of Olivia, with her beautiful house and her skin carpets, flashed through my mind. How easily the monstrous can blend into the mundane. How it can wear a charming facade. This wasn't just a struggling artist. This was something else. This was my kind of trouble. The kind I ran from. The kind that always found me. He slammed the door to the basement storage room behind him, the sound echoing through the concrete space. For days, Johnny practically lived in that spare room of his apartment. I could hear him. It was no longer just hushed conversations, but full-blown arguments. Shrieks, sometimes. Giggles that were too high-pitched, too manic, too wrong. Scuffles that sounded like a wrestling match. Furniture scraping across the floor. Sometimes a desperate, animalistic whimpering from Johnny himself. The noises were punctuated by periods of unnatural quiet, silences that were more terrifying than the sounds themselves. Heavy and oppressive. It was the silence of a predator waiting, or prey holding its breath. Every time I patrolled the hallway, my ear pressed against the door. The sounds would abruptly cease, as if the room itself was holding its breath, listening to me. Like the walls were alive, breathing, like that house on Sycamore Grove, the way it had watched, the way it had learned. I started leaving my mag light by the door of my small unit, ready to grab it. The go bag was already packed, as always. Cash, clean clothes, first aid kit, the physical manifestation of my readiness to bolt. But something held me back. That damn conscience. And a morbid curiosity that was a twin to my fear. What exactly was going on in there? Was it a person? Was it something else? One Saturday, a notice went up on the building's bulletin board. Johnny had gotten a last-minute call to fill in at a company picnic, a desperate, fleeting chance to earn some money. It was late afternoon when he finally left, looking like a ghost in his garish costume, his face already painted, the rainbow wig a cruel mockery of his sunken eyes. I watched him go, then waited. My old analog watch ticked off the minutes. 1 minute, 5, 10. The silence from Unit 3B was deafening. This was my chance. I took the master key. It was a risk, a huge risk. But the sounds from that apartment had been gnawing at me, burrowing under my skin like a parasite. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted the key into the lock. The tumblers clicked, a soft, metallic whisper. I pushed the door open, just a crack. The apartment was a disaster. Strewn everywhere were clown props, deflated balloons, rubber chickens, oversized shoes, a pile of bright, synthetic wigs that looked like tangled birds' nests. The air was thick and cloying, smelling of stale grease paint, cheap perfume, and something else. Something faintly metallic and coppery, like old blood or rust. My stomach churned. This was far worse than I'd imagined. This was a man losing his grip, losing his mind, or having it stolen from him. Then I heard it. Voices, muffled, coming from deeper within the apartment, from what I assumed was the bedroom. A low growl, then a high-pitched, mocking giggle that sent shivers down my spine. This wasn't just Johnny talking to himself. This was an argument, a heated, terrifying argument. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape its cage. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to close the door, to forget what I'd heard, to get in my truck and drive until the Sterling Arms was a distant, forgotten memory. It was the same primal urge that had flooded me when I realized that smiling man with the gentle eyes wanted to carve me up for dinner. The urge to flee. But the whimper I heard next, a sound of pure despair, solidified my decision. Johnny's voice, and something else, something sharper, colder. That wasn't him. I crept forward, my steps silent on the threadbare carpet. The apartment was a claustrophobic maze of clown paraphernalia and discarded food containers. As I neared the bedroom door, the voices became clearer. "No, it's just a crummy dinner. Of course I care about you." Johnny's voice, raw with desperation. And then, a second voice, shrill and venomous, completely devoid of human warmth. "You lie, you always lie, you want to abandon me, just like they all do." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a person. The inflection, the impossible pitch. It was like something being forced out through a tiny, inhuman orifice. My mind, which had tried desperately to find a mundane explanation, a hidden wife, a secret lover, a disturbed roommate, shattered. This was exactly the kind of unholy, impossible thing I dedicated my life to avoiding. My hand flew to my watch, my fingers tracing the cold glass, a futile attempt to ground myself in reality. I pushed the door open, slowly at first, then burst through, the flimsy wood groaning in protest. What I saw froze me in place, a tableau of pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel. Johnny wasn't speaking on the phone. He was kneeling on the floor, sweat plastering strands of his dark hair to his forehead, arguing furiously with a puppet, not just any puppet. A Raggedy Ann-style puppet, about 2 feet tall, with bright red yarn curls. A tiny French beret cocked jauntily on its head and button eyes that seemed to glow with a malevolent light. It sat on an overturned milk crate, its stitched mouth moving with grotesque animation as Johnny gesticulated wildly. Its tiny fabric hand was gripping Johnny's wrist, white-knuckled. "We've been talking, me and Mr. Giggles," Johnny stammered, his eyes wide, vacant, fixed on the puppet, oblivious to my presence for a horrifying moment. His face was a mask of terror and exhaustion, streaked with what looked like tears and dried grease paint. The puppet's head swiveled, its button eyes, catching the dim light from the hallway, fixed on me. A prickle of pure, undiluted dread ran down my spine. The air in the room grew heavy, cloying, like breathing wet wool. "We don't care for the way you've been talking about clowns," it said, its voice climbing octaves, shrill and piercing, yet impossibly deep at the same time, a vocal paradox that scraped at the raw nerves of my sanity. It was like a child's voice, filtered through static and malice, not from Johnny's throat, from it. My husband had completely snapped. That was my first desperate thought. Johnny, the quiet, shy man, was talking to a doll, and it was talking back, and it wasn't his voice. Before I could react, before my brain could even fully process the sheer, impossible wrongness of it, the puppet, or rather, the force that moved it, that spoke through it, lunged. It wasn't a graceful lunge. It was a jerky, unnatural, almost spastic movement. The puppet's tiny form propelled forward, pulling Johnny with it. He stumbled, catching himself, but his eyes remained locked on the puppet, his body seeming to move against his will, a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. The small fabric hand released Johnny's wrist and clawed at the air, its movements too fast, too precise for a mere doll. It wasn't lunging at Johnny. It was lunging at me. I reacted on instinct, a lifetime of narrow escapes kicking in. I sidestepped, the puppet's tiny, surprisingly sharp fingers brushing against my worn leather jacket. A chill, colder than any winter wind, passed through me. This wasn't just a breakdown. This was a possession, or something worse, something that had taken root, burrowed deep, and was now fully in control. The kind of thing that once upon a time, centuries ago, people knew to burn with fire. It reminded me of the mirror, of seeing myself, but not myself. The imposter looking back, the horror that wore a familiar face. Johnny cried out, a strangled sound, as the puppet's pull intensified, yanking his body, forcing his arm out. He was fighting it. I could see it in the desperate struggle in his eyes, but it was a losing battle. The puppet's high-pitched giggling filled the room, growing louder, more triumphant. It wanted me. It wanted to twist Johnny into a weapon against me. A sickening scuffle followed. Johnny, half possessed, half fighting, stumbled and lurched, the puppet directing his movements with unnatural strength. It kept trying to force his hand towards me, a grotesque, flailing mockery of an attack. His whimpers mingled with the puppet's unholy shrieks. I dodged, ducked, and tried to create space. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to stop this. I couldn't fight a man who wasn't in control of himself, and I definitely couldn't fight a doll that was clearly more than a doll. What could sever its hold? What could break this thing's grip? Then I saw it, the glint of steel on the floor. My old Zwilling chef's knife, the one I'd sharpened in the basement. It must have fallen from a table during the struggle. It lay there, a beacon of cold, brutal practicality amidst the supernatural chaos. Johnny saw it too. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, cleared. A flash of pure, terrified lucidity. He understood. He had to sever the connection, not the puppet, but himself. His hand, the one the puppet was manipulating, was still technically his hand. With a guttural roar, a sound of primal desperation, Johnny twisted. He used his other hand, the free one, to pin the puppet-controlled arm to the floor, jamming it against a broken leg of an old wooden chair. The puppet shrieked, a sound of pure rage and betrayal. "No, you can't! You're mine!" But Johnny, with a strength born of terror and a desperate, fleeting lucidity, grabbed the knife. His pale, trembling fingers closed around the familiar handle. His gaze met mine, a flicker of understanding, of apology, of a request for help I couldn't answer. Then he plunged the butcher knife into his own limb. The sound was wet, sickening, a tearing of flesh and muscle. The crimson spray against the cheap floral wallpaper was the first thing that registered, a grotesque counterpoint to the saccharine sweet laughter still echoing in my head. Then the scream, not human, not quite, but a raw, tearing sound ripped from Johnny's throat, followed by a high-pitched, gleeful shriek that resonated with something ancient and vile. My eyes, already wide, tracked the glint of steel, then the sickening, wet thud as something vital gave way. A butcher knife, the kind you buy for tenderloin, now severing more than just meat. It was cutting ties. The puppet went rigid. Its button eyes glowed for a moment, then dimmed. It fell silent, its tiny fabric body slumping, lifeless. The malevolent presence that had filled the room, pressing down on my chest, receded, leaving behind only the metallic tang of blood and the echo of a man's agony. Johnny lay on the floor, his eyes wide and unseeing, his chest heaving, a ragged, bloody mess where his forearm had been. The knife was still clutched in his severed hand, which lay limp on the carpet, the puppet still grotesquely entwined around it. I stumbled back, my hands clammy, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. This was it. This was the kind of horror that didn't just break your mind. It broke your body too. It consumed everything. It reminded me of the true nature of things, The way the universe was just a farm, a place where things were grown and harvested. Not for love or grace, but for something alien and terrible. There was no escape, not in life, and certainly not in death. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb, and called emergency services. My voice was a gravelly whisper as I explained, as coherently as I could, what had happened. A man, an accident, a knife. I omitted the puppet. Some things, even for the emergency services, were beyond belief. Paramedics arrived quickly, their sirens wailing, a stark, jarring intrusion of the mundane into the horrific. Johnny, pale and weak, his breath coming in shallow gasps, looked up at me as they started to work on him. His eyes, no longer vacant, held a flicker of something almost normal. Things really got out of hand there. Huh. Leo, he whispered, his voice thin, barely audible above the medic's urgent commands. A ghost of a smile, genuine this time, touched his lips. I looked at him, at the destroyed man, and a choked, tearless sound escaped me, a half laugh, half sob. Ever the entertainer. Even when the show cost him an arm and a piece of his sanity, he still tried to make a joke. It was a grim, dark punchline to a story I never wanted to be a part of, another twisted knot in the chronicles of my own slow unraveling. And as they wheeled him out, the silence in Unit 3B returned, heavier, darker, promising nothing but more to come. The water hit him, not with a splash, but with a horrifying, sizzling glitch. His form, already a shimmering, unstable mess of pixels and desperate, grasping limbs, spasmed. The sound he made wasn't a scream, not really, but a high-pitched, grinding shriek of broken data, like a dial-up modem having a seizure while being dismembered. My ears rang, and a metallic taste flooded my mouth. He was dissolving, or retreating. I wasn't sure which, but the impossible, monstrous thing that had climbed out of a goddamn laptop screen was recoiling. And for a split second, an eternity, the pure, unadulterated terror of it all gave way to a single, impossible thought. It worked. That was the kind of desperate, illogical act you make when your brain has short-circuited from terror. It was a choice born from a night that began, as all bad nights do, with a simple, ordinary shift, a cup of bitter coffee, and a blinking cursor on a screen that was about to show me a nightmare I hadn't even known existed. Another Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? The days blurred into an indistinguishable gray smear when your life was measured in truck stops and the fluorescent hum of night shifts. My current gig was contract work for a fledgling digital forensics firm, mostly retrieving lost data for panicked accountants or tracing anonymous threats for the perpetually aggrieved. Easy money, anonymous, and crucially, solitary. Just how I liked it. This particular evening, however, had come with a strange addendum. An old client, a small-time tech entrepreneur named Harding, had called in a frantic state about an unforeseen digital haunting. My kind of nonsense. I'd taken the job because the pay was surprisingly good, enough to cover another month of cheap motels and stale coffee, and because curiosity, that persistent little maggot, had burrowed its way into my brain. "This is Edward," Harding had explained over the phone, his voice strained and reedy. "He was difficult, brilliant, but difficult. He died last month, froze to death in his car, but his account, his presence, it's still active, and it's terrorizing a former girlfriend." I'd grunted, adjusting the worn leather of my jacket over my shoulders. "Digital ghost, huh? Kid with too much time and a grudge. Probably. Tell him to get a life, or a good VPN." Harding had ignored the sarcasm, which usually worked like a charm to get people to back off. "No, Mr. Vance, you don't understand. It's impossible. He's affecting the network itself. We've got logs of his activity, but it defies all known protocols. And the girl, Natasha, She's genuinely terrified. My gut, that unreliable oracle of impending doom, clenched tighter than a fist around a handful of broken glass. It was the same feeling I got before the world decided to show its teeth. A familiar chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. It was the scent of the uncanny, the whisper of something trying to tear the fabric of reality. I'd learned to recognize it, to fear it, and, on occasion, to reluctantly follow it. My fatal flaw, the reluctant conscience, was already stirring. Damn it. So, here I was, hunched over a workstation in a darkened server room. The hum of cooling fans, a monotonous drone in the sterile air. The room smelled of ozone and dust, a scent that always made me think of forgotten data and silent screams. On the monitor, a forensic suite displayed a tangled mess of network logs and communication protocols. Harding had given me remote access to Natasha's system, and more disturbingly, to Edward's old development drive, a labyrinth of custom-built programs and encrypted files. My old analog wristwatch felt heavy on my wrist, a cold metal anchor against the rising tide of unease. I checked it, not for the time, but for the comforting weight, the familiar click of its gears, a mechanical heartbeat in a world going digital. The initial reports from Natasha were typical cyberstalking, social media comments from a dead man's account, harassing emails. I scrolled through them, cynical. Anyone could fake that. A bereaved relative, a disgruntled friend. The digital footprint was easy enough to mimic, especially for someone with Edward's alleged tech wizardry. But then I saw the Instagram screenshot, a photo of Natasha at sunset, and a comment, "Edward, nice sunset, Natasha," followed by a flurry of replies from her friends, all asking if the account was hacked. Natasha had blocked Edward's account, yet the comments persisted. That was the first prickle of genuine unease. Bypassing a block on Instagram wasn't impossible, but it required a level of sophistication beyond a simple prankster. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the metadata. No IP spoofing. The comment appeared to originate from within Instagram's own system, as if Edward's presence had simply manifested there, like a ghost in the machine. A cold, cynical laugh bubbled up in my throat, but it died before it reached my lips. Ghosts, I understood. The ones that moaned from darkened corners or flickered in your peripheral vision. But a ghost in the goddamn cloud? That was a new one for my collection of existential dread. I pulled up Edward's old development files. His online alias had been something pompous like Archon. The files were a digital mausoleum, filled with code, notes, and strange fragmented documents. He'd been obsessed with consciousness, with uploading the soul. I snorted. Sci-fi nonsense. Most of these self-proclaimed innovators were just glorified fanboys. But then I started noticing the anomalies. Buried deep within his custom programming, intertwined with what looked like attempts at advanced AI, were references to something called gray code. It wasn't a standard language. It looked wrong, symbols I didn't recognize, archaic terms woven into algorithms. It felt less like programming and more like incantation, an underground programming language of the occult, as Natasha had described it in her panicked messages to Harding. My mind, already a crowded attic of horrors, brought forth vague, unsettling memories from long ago, whispers of things not meant for the conscious mind, things connected to my own fragmented past, to the fire, to the place I never spoke of, the house on Sycamore Grove. The connection was tenuous, a phantom limb ache, but it was there. This wasn't just tech. This was tainted. I decided to observe Natasha's live feed. Harding had provided access to her smart home security camera, a standard feature I'd previously scoffed at as an invasion of privacy. Now, it was my window into the unfolding nightmare. I watched the feed on a separate monitor, the sterile blue light reflecting in my weary eyes. Natasha was in her bedroom, scrolling on her phone, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Her laptop was on her desk, closed. Then, the screen flickered. It wasn't a power surge. It glowed faintly, then brightened. The laptop lid, by all accounts, should have been closed. But on my monitor, I could see the image from inside her room, reflected in the now open laptop screen. It was displaying Facebook. Who still used Facebook? I thought, a sarcastic comment that remained locked behind my teeth. The screen scrolled by itself. My eyes narrowed. Remote access. But who? The scrolling stopped on Edward's profile. An old photo of him and Natasha, smiling, from happier days. Natasha murmured something I couldn't make out, likely to herself, assuming some living person was behind it. And then, the photo moved. My breath hitched. The screen in front of me, displaying Natasha's laptop, showed Edward frozen in a smile, then suddenly, horrifyingly, untethered. He strolled, not across the image, but within it, towards the point of view of the original photographer. He expanded, filling the frame, his eyes, previously locked in a digital smile, now fixing on the camera, on Natasha, on me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My brain, that stubborn organ of logic, screamed of impossible. This wasn't deep fake. This wasn't a pre-recorded video. Edward's movements were fluid, organic, unsettlingly aware. "Hello, Natasha." Edward's voice crackled through the workstation speakers. It was distorted, garbled, as if forced through 1,000 layers of broken code and static. The sound made my teeth ache. I instinctively clapped a hand over my old wristwatch, tracing the cold metal, a grounding ritual against the surreal. "You look so beautiful," the voice gushed, inhuman, yet sickeningly familiar in its possessive tone. "I like your new hair, and the dog pajamas are adorable," Natasha yelped, a quiet, horrified sound that reverberated through the silent server room. My blood ran cold. The new hair, the pajamas, impossible for a pre-recording. This was live. This was Edward, or whatever Edward had become. It was using Natasha's webcam to see her, and if it could see her, it could see me. My eyes darted to the small, unblinking lens of the camera mounted above my own workstation. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Then, the true horror began. Edward's pixelated face, still filling Natasha's screen, shifted. The genial gentleman facade, so carefully maintained in the original photo, crumbled. His head tilted, a grotesque, jerky motion, like a broken animatronic. His smile, previously charming, stretched wider, becoming something predatory, filled with a black malignancy. His pupils, previously dark and human, began to recede, shrinking, then vanishing entirely, leaving only two stark, white, soulless eyes. The thing on Natasha's screen was no longer a man. It was a digital predator, a nightmare distilled into pure, corrupted data. A low, guttural thud sounded from Natasha's room, picked up by the microphone of her camera. I saw Edward's hands, shimmering, translucent, press against the screen. The laptop screen itself flexed, rippled, like a pool disturbed by something pressing up from beneath. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. This wasn't just remote access. This wasn't just code. This was manifestation. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, some loophole, some trick of light or angle. There was none. I'd seen impossible things before, things that gnawed at the edges of sanity, things that left a lingering stink of ozone and fear, but they usually left a physical mark. This felt cleaner, yet somehow dirtier. This was a violation of fundamental laws, a breach between worlds not through a portal of flesh and blood, but through the mundane conduit of a Wi-Fi signal. The chilling thought that Edward had found a way to bridge the digital and the physical, not as an AI, but as a conscious, malicious entity, sent a jolt of ice through my veins. the memory of a scream. Not this one, but one from a long, long time ago. A scream that had been seared into my very bones, threatened to surface. Natasha screamed, a raw, piercing sound of absolute terror. She scrambled from her bed, bolting for the door. Just as her hand reached the knob, a blinding flash of white light erupted from her laptop screen, momentarily whiting out my monitor. A piercing, distorted wail, like a chorus of digital agony, screamed from the workstation's speakers. "You're not leaving me again," Edward's voice echoed, no longer garbled, but clear, resonant, and utterly devoid of humanity. Natasha spun around, her eyes wide with unbridled horror. I watched, transfixed, as the impossible continued to unfold. Edward, a grotesque, shimmering figure, began to pull himself free from the laptop screen. The screen itself stretched around him, like elasticated rubber, distorting, pixelating, then snapping back into place as his limbs, long and spindly, glitched into the physical world. He adjusted his posture, slowly, deliberately, his white, empty eyes fixed on Natasha. A fiendish, Cheshire cat grin stretched across his translucent face. "I found a way to live forever," he whispered, the sound a sibilant hiss that seemed to snake its way directly into my skull. "If you join me, I promise we won't ever fight again." My hands clenched into fists. My initial impulse was to run, to shut down the system, to sever the connection, to do anything to get this digital abomination out of my sight. But the familiar, sickening pull of my reluctant conscience held me rooted. This wasn't just Edward's ghost. This was a thing that had found a way to weaponize data, to cross the threshold. If I didn't stop it, or at least understand it, who else might it target? Another loose end. My life was a tapestry woven from loose ends, each one a snag waiting to unravel. Natasha was battling her bedroom door, which was clearly being held shut by an unseen force. She yanked at the handle, whimpering. Edward, his glitching legs unsteady, stumbled towards her, his head tilted to the side, that malevolent grin plastered on his face. Natasha screeched, turning back to the door, desperate. I had to do something. But what? My go bag was in the corner of the server room, filled with the usual survival gear, but nothing that could fight a digital entity. A heavy mag light, not against a ghost. A first aid kit for psychological trauma. Maybe then Natasha did something truly insane. She darted towards her bedside table, swerving past Edward's outstretched, shimmering arms. She grabbed a half-full glass of water. Edward's lips parted, revealing a pit of blackness where his mouth should have been. That same high-pitched wail erupted from his demonic form. He knew, without a moment's thought. Natasha launched the glass of water. It arced through the air, sparkling in the dim light of the bedroom. And then, it hit him, not with a splash, but with that horrifying, sizzling glitch. The sound he made wasn't a scream, not really, but a high-pitched, grinding shriek of broken data, like a dial-up modem having a seizure while being dismembered. My ears rang, and a metallic taste flooded my mouth. He was dissolving, or retreating. I wasn't sure which, but the impossible, monstrous thing that had climbed out of a goddamn laptop screen was recoiling. For a split second, an eternity, the pure, unadulterated terror of it all gave way to a single, impossible thought. It worked. Edward spasmed, his translucent skin rippling as the water soaked through him. His unbound digital form retreated, and I watched, my eyes wide, as the laptop screen seemed to suck him back in, the image stabilizing, becoming a static picture once more. Natasha's bedroom door swung open with a bang. She didn't hesitate. She was out of the room, out of the apartment, presumably out of her mind. I sat there once staring at the monitors, the digital remnants of the horror slowly fading from the logs. The server room felt colder than before, despite the constant hum of the machines. My heart was still a frantic drum solo in my chest. My hands trembled, but I didn't notice it until I tried to trace the face of my watch. It had worked. Water, the oldest enemy of electronics, a primal, physical solution to a digital, existential threat. The sheer absurdity of it made me want to laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. But I didn't. The fear was too deep. I killed the network connection to Natasha's apartment, wiped the logs of my remote access, and then, for good measure, I pulled the entire Edward Archon server offline, isolating it, sealing it away. Harding would be furious, but I didn't care. I packed my go bag, my movements stiff, automatic. The thought of staying another moment in this place, surrounded by the invisible hum of data, the potential for another manifestation, was unbearable. My truck was still outside, a steel box waiting to carry me far away. I needed to move. Again. Always again. I haven't touched a screen. Not really, until now. I'm in a greasy, brightly lit diner, miles from anywhere. The kind of place where the coffee is industrial sludge and the pie is suspiciously symmetrical. The diner's Wi-Fi is probably terrible, which is why I picked it. People around, noise, distraction. I'm using a beat-up old laptop I bought from a pawn shop, one with no webcam, no smart features, just a keyboard and a screen. It feels alien, dangerous. Every flicker in my peripheral vision, every hum of the neon sign, makes me flinch. I feel the phantom touch of Edward's pixelated hand, the sound of his corrupted scream. I just needed to write this down, to get it out, to pin it to a page, like a specimen in a jar. I'm not sure what good it will do. I can't run from this. He's not just a ghost in a machine. He's a concept, a virus that spread through the very idea of technology. He's everywhere now, just waiting for the right signal. I keep seeing flickering screens out of the corner of my eye. Should I get off the grid and avoid technology for the rest of my life? How does one even do that in this world? I don't know where to go or what to do. I have nightmares of being imprisoned in Edward's eternal digital prison, a single screaming data point in his infinite, cruel loop. And the worst part? I know. Deep down, this is just the beginning. Total character count, 9673. The stench hit me first, a putrid, coppery reek that tasted of rust and raw, terrified meat, a smell that clung to the inside of my nostrils like wet fur. It was the smell of something immense and ancient, something that had never known a cage or a leash, something that stalked the deep places of the world. Then came the sound, a guttural shriek that ripped the night apart, a sound that wasn't human, not entirely animal, but a grotesque fusion of both, echoing off the ancient trees as if the very forest were screaming in agony. My breath hitched, a painful knot in my chest, and I pressed myself deeper into the flimsy nylon of the tent, my eyes fixed on the silhouetted horrors outside. One moment, I was trapped in a canvas cocoon, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it stole my breath. The next, I was back on the road, miles away, the memory a fresh scar on my already mottled psyche. It started, as these things always do, with a flicker of hope, a desperate, foolish attempt at normalcy. My name is Leo Vance, and I've learned that normal is just a lull before the next storm, a brief, fragile quiet before the universe remembers you exist and decides it's time to send another monster your way. This time, the monster wore a beautiful smile and called herself Wendy. Dating? God, what a joke. It's a swamp of bots, bad intentions, and enough emotional baggage to sink a small freighter. Every time I've tried, it's ended with me either discovering some deep-seated psychosis in the other person, or them discovering the unspeakable, ever-present baggage I carry, the kind that tends to make things go bump, crash, and occasionally explode in the night. So, when Wendy, with her easy laugh and eyes that seemed to actually see me, entered my orbit. I was wary. More than wary, I was suspicious. My worn leather jacket, a second skin against the chill of the world, felt heavier than usual. My fingers, twitching with an old anxiety, brushed against the cold metal of my analog wristwatch. 0:30. As always, the ticking gave me a faint, mechanical comfort, a predictable rhythm in a life that had none. I'd met her on one of my transient gigs, a graveyard shift at a distribution center way out in the sticks. She was an anomaly, a bright spark in a world I'd grown accustomed to seeing in shades of industrial gray. I'd noticed the little things. Of course, my observational skills, honed by years of running from things, are less a gift and more a curse. She never ate, not really, just picked at things, pushed food around, and the sounds from her house, on that one visit, unnerving. A low, guttural growl that made the hair on my arms stand up, followed by a crashing noise that sounded like a small tree falling, and then silence. A silence that was too heavy, too complete. I'd shrugged it off, or rather, I'd forced myself to shrug it off. Compared to the spectral whispers that sometimes followed me from place to place, or the way the air would suddenly turn icy cold and still. Even in a crowded room, Wendy's peculiarities seemed manageable. She makes me feel good about myself, the original me might have said. The current me, the Leo Vance who measures life in nightmares and escape routes, would have scoffed. No, it wasn't about feeling good. It was about an uneasy truce. She didn't press. She didn't ask questions about the haunted look in my eyes or the way I instinctively scanned every room for exits. And honestly, returning to the dating scene, the endless, soul-crushing cycle of superficiality and disappointment felt like a fate worse than dealing with a girlfriend who might occasionally transform into something with fangs. So what if she was a little unusual? We had nicknames. She was Country Girl. I was City Boy, a shallow, meaningless moniker. But it was something. It was a connection, however tenuous, however potentially suicidal. So when she suggested a camping trip, a real camping trip, deep into a forest, far from any signal or civilization, my gut screamed, no. My conscience and that damned self-destructive voice whispered, why not? What's the worst that could happen? I packed my go bag, as always, making sure the heavy mag light was fully charged, just in case. The forest was beautiful. She was right about that. The kind of raw, untamed beauty that makes you forget concrete and asphalt ever existed. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in shifting emerald and gold, dappling the forest floor. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the sun on my head. Insects droned, a lazy symphony, and distant birds called out, their songs echoing through the ancient silence. Time, usually a relentless whip, seemed to stretch, each breath a conscious act of inhaling tranquility. It was the kind of peace that felt fragile, like a thin skin over something much older and more dangerous. But peace nonetheless. Wendy was in her element. She moved through the woods with a primal grace, her steps light and sure. She showed me how to distribute the weight in my pack so it didn't feel like a phantom limb, how to lace my boots for blister-free comfort. She pointed out flora I'd never seen, identifying them by names that sounded like poetry. Jack in the Pulpit, Ghost Pipe. She knew the local fauna too, pointing out deer tracks and the telltale scratch marks of a climbing bear. Sometimes, she'd fall silent, allowing me to soak in the immense, breathing quiet of the woods, a silence so profound it seemed to hum in my ears. I found myself thinking, for a dangerous, fleeting moment, that maybe this wasn't so bad. Maybe I could trade the sterile anonymity of hotel rooms and truck stops for this. Then the smell hit. Not subtle, not creeping. It was a punch to the gut. A wave of putrefaction so potent it made my stomach churn. Rotting meat, old blood, Something else, something fetid and undeniably wrong. It was like a butcher shop had exploded inside a morgue and then festered for a week under a summer sun. I gagged, clapping a hand over my mouth, the taste of bile rising in my throat. My eyes watered. "What the hell is that?" I choked out, my voice thick with revulsion. Wendy, already a few steps ahead, didn't even flinch. She just looked straight ahead, her jaw set, a grim determination in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "Pick up the pace, city boy. We'll be past it soon enough." Her voice was tight, strained. I didn't question her. I just stumbled forward, desperate to escape the cloying horror of that scent. It faded eventually, leaving only a lingering metallic tang in the back of my mouth. But the memory, the wrongness of it, stuck. It was a sharp crack in the peaceful facade, a glimpse beneath the veneer. The rest of the hike was uneventful, a return to the serene calm, though I found myself more vigilant, my senses on high alert. Setting up the tent was quick, thanks to Wendy's practiced efficiency. She snapped poles into place, unfurled the fly with an expert flick of her wrist, securing pegs into the earth with swift, powerful blows. I, the city boy, mostly just handed her things and tried not to look entirely useless. Soon, a cheerful fire crackled and spat, chasing away the encroaching shadows. Dinner was, predictably, a solo affair. She'd pulled out supplies for one, enough steak to fill my plate, but nothing for her. I watched her, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. What did she eat? Or when did she eat? The thought crossed my mind, fleeting and chilling, that perhaps she didn't eat in the conventional sense. Perhaps her diet was specific, but then she'd smile, a genuine, warm smile, and I'd push the thoughts away. Better not to ask, better to accept the anomaly. She was good company, witty and engaging, and despite the unanswered questions, I found myself relaxing into the evening. The steak was perfectly seared, a rare, tender masterpiece, proof that whatever her dietary habits, she knew her way around a campfire. Later, nestled in the sleeping bag, the soft symphony of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl lulled me toward sleep. For a while, the tent felt like a refuge, a flimsy but secure bubble against the vast, indifferent wilderness. For a while, I almost forgot. I woke with a jolt, the abrupt transition from sleep to full, pounding awareness leaving me disoriented. The tent was still, unnervingly so. The crickets had fallen silent, the owls too. I was alone. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, began to uncoil in my gut. Wendy, the self-proclaimed night owl and outdoor enthusiast, was gone. It wasn't entirely unexpected. She'd mentioned a fascination with nocturnal wildlife. But the silence, it was the kind of silence that precedes a scream, the suffocating quiet that descends when something truly unnatural is at play. My bladder, however, cared little for ominous silences. Nature called, with an insistence that brooked no debate. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the zipper, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A primal instinct, deeper than reason, told me to stay put, to remain hidden. But the urge was too strong. Slowly, meticulously, I unzipped the tent flap, the metallic rasp of the slider sounding impossibly loud in the oppressive quiet. The cold, crisp night air instantly bit at my exposed skin. I squeezed out of the tent, my movements slow, deliberate, like a predator or prey afraid to make a sound. My gaze drifted upwards. The stars, God, the stars, they were an impossible tapestry of diamond dust, a glittering, vibrant blanket flung across the inky blackness. You never saw this in the city, never saw the true, terrifying scale of the cosmos. For a fleeting moment, the raw, indifferent beauty of it all almost made me forget my immediate, pressing need. But then the internal pressure became undeniable. That feeling, that pure, unadulterated relief when you've been holding it in too long. It was almost euphoric, A brief, blissful distraction from the creeping dread. Almost. As I stood there, lost in the fleeting moment of corporal release, the smell hit again. This time, it was worse. Far, far worse than anything on the trail. It was the same sickening, metallic sweet decay, but amplified, concentrated, as if whatever had caused it was now directly in front of me, breathing it into my face. It was the smell of death, but not natural death. This was a deeper rot, an ancient, consuming hunger. And with it came the fear, not just the physical fear of a threat, but the cold, creeping, existential terror you feel as a child when the floorboards creak overhead. And you realize that the sounds do go bump in the night, and they're not just the house settling. My bladder seized, a sudden, panicked spasm, cutting off the flow. I fumbled frantically with my pants, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the zipper. Every nerve ending screamed at me to run, to dive back into the flimsy sanctuary of the tent. Inside, I collapsed, my lungs burning, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. My hand instinctively reached for my go bag, for the familiar, comforting weight of the mag light. But then I froze. Light, a beacon. Turning it on would be like shouting my location into the vast, hungry darkness. A blue tent in the middle of a black forest was already a poor attempt at camouflage, but a flashlight, a focused beam of pure white, would be a lighthouse for anything within miles. My analog watch, usually a source of small comfort, suddenly felt like a weight, a heavy anchor dragging me down. I could feel the cold metal against my wrist, but I couldn't bring myself to check the time. Time felt irrelevant. I sat in the pitch black, suffocating silence, listening to the roar of my own blood in my ears. Every muscle tensed, waiting. Waiting for what? For the smell to fade? For the silence to break? For something to tear through the thin fabric and end it all? The minutes stretched into an eternity. The smell did eventually recede, a slow, agonizing retreat, leaving behind only the ghost of its horror. My body was still thrumming with adrenaline, raw and exposed. Sleep was out of the question. I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, until the sky outside the tent began to lighten, a pale, bruised purple, or so I thought. I woke again to the softest brush of skin against my arm, and the familiar scent of wood smoke and a faint, sweet something that was uniquely Wendy. She was there, curled against me, one leg thrown carelessly over mine, one arm draped over my chest, and she was, as always when she seemed to materialize back into the tent, completely naked. My brain, still muzzy from the adrenaline crash and the sudden return to a semblance of normal, struggled to reconcile the image of a serene, sleeping woman with the terror of the night. Had it all been a dream, a vivid, stomach-churning nightmare, brought on by the strange new environment and the lingering scent of that godforsaken stench on the trail? I told myself that. I had to. My fingers traced the smooth, cool skin of her arm, feeling the curve of muscle beneath. She stirred, a slow, languid stretch, and then those green eyes, flecked with gold, blinked open, looking up at me. "Sleep all right, city boy?" Her voice was rough with sleep, a low purr. "You seem to have some pretty rough dreams in the middle of the night." She smiled lazily, a soft, inviting curve of her lips. At the time, her words made perfect sense. It was the easy answer, the comforting lie I was desperate to believe. The sun was rising, painting the world in warm, reassuring light. The night, with its silent horrors and putrid smells, seemed distant, unreal, like a bad fever dream. We lay there for a while longer, tangled together, enjoying the quiet intimacy of the morning. For a moment, the weary wanderer in me, the one always bracing for the next shoe to drop, almost felt content. But the real world, the world that refused to leave me alone, had other plans. When I finally crawled out of the tent, the illusion of normalcy shattered. The campsite was a wreck. It looked like a tornado had gone through it. Our carefully stacked supplies were scattered, some torn open, others completely crushed. My go bag was still intact. Thank God, a testament to its sturdy construction. But it had been tossed a good 20 feet from where I'd left it. The fire pit was disturbed, embers scattered. The ground was churned up, littered with broken branches and overturned rocks. It was as if something enormous, something with destructive intent, had rampaged through our little pocket of peace. Hey, I called out, my voice flat, hollow. You might want to take a look at this. Wendy emerged from the tent a moment later, her face scrunching up in a frown. She surveyed the chaos with a familiar, almost weary resignation. Must have been a bear. They usually don't come out this way, so I wasn't too worried about them. Guess that's on me. Sorry. A bear. That made sense. It was a logical explanation. Bears were big, strong, messy. I clung to that thought, my mind desperately trying to impose order on the unsettling evidence. As we started the arduous task of cleaning up, moving debris, and salvaging what we could, I noticed the tracks. Big. Too big for any bear I'd ever seen, even in documentaries. They looked more like dog prints, but gargantuan, like a wolf on steroids, or something even bigger. And then, mixed in with them, the hoof prints. Deer. I knelt, tracing the outline with a hesitant finger. They were more than twice the length of my hand, each one a deep impression in the soft earth. Deer this big? I'd always imagined them as graceful, delicate creatures. These prints belonged to something that could stomp a car flat, something from a nightmare. The memory of the smell, the impossible silence, and now these impossible tracks gnawed at the edges of my carefully constructed belief in the bear. But I didn't voice my doubts. I just nodded, grunted, and kept cleaning. What else was there to do? The rest of the day passed in a blur of mundane activities. We salvaged breakfast, went for another hike. Though my vigilance was now a constant, nagging thrum beneath my skin, and made another dinner. I tried to enjoy it, tried to push the lingering unease to the back of my mind. For a time, I almost succeeded. I was back to being just Leo, the guy on a camping trip with his girlfriend, forgetting the creeping dread of the night. Almost. That night, it returned, and this time, it brought a guest. I awoke with a familiar, suffocating stillness. The crickets, the owls, everything was silent. My heart rate instantly spiked, a painful drum against my ribs. I was still tangled with Wendy, her warmth a fragile comfort, but it did little to dispel the overwhelming sense of dread. The stench, that same putrid, metallic sweet decay, was back, stronger than ever. It permeated the thin fabric of the tent, filled my lungs with its noxious presence. But it wasn't just the smell, there was light. A strange, unnatural brightness illuminated the inside of the tent. It had to be a full moon, or nearly full, because I could clearly see the silhouette of something immense moving outside. A deer, I thought at first. A gigantic deer. The shadow passed directly between us and the night sky, impossibly tall, unnaturally slender. But then my eyes adjusted, and the moonlight seemed to cut through the fabric of the tent, projecting a clearer image. It wasn't just tall, it was standing on its hind legs. Its limbs were too long, too spindly, ending in hooves that looked like cruel, blunted weapons. And when its head moved, turning towards the tent, the moonlight glinted off something impossibly sharp, impossibly white. A mouthful of teeth, not deer teeth. These were pointed, jagged, predatory. My breath hitched. Every fiber of my being screamed. Panic, cold and raw, seized me, locking my muscles. My breathing grew shallow, ragged, each inhale a painful struggle against the terror constricting my chest. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, deafening drumbeat that I was sure whatever was outside could hear. My mind went blank, reduced to a single, primal instinct. Hide. Then I felt Wendy stir beside me. A small shift, a soft murmur. The rational part of my brain, the part that still clung to the notion of human connection and protection, surged. My considerably smaller girlfriend. I had to protect her. She couldn't face whatever that was. I was about to whisper, to warn her, to tell her to stay quiet, to play dead, when she looked up at me. Her eyes, luminous in the dim light, reflected a faint, eerie glow, like a cat's in the dark. She raised a finger to her lips, a silent command for me to do the same. Then, her voice a mere wisp of sound. Barely audible over the roaring in my ears, she whispered, "Stay in the tent." She began to move, to rise. And then, my cursed conscience, that fatal flaw that has dragged me into every godforsaken mess of my life, kicked in. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't. Not into that. My hand shot out, grabbing her wrist before she could fully exit the tent. Her skin was warm, smooth. But then she turned back, and in the faint, moonlit gloom, I saw it. Her eyes were not human. They glowed with an internal light, a predatory intensity. And as I watched, horrified, her nails elongated, sharpening into dark, gleaming claws, I released her immediately, my hand recoiling as if from a live wire. The fear I felt, looking at her, was almost as potent as the terror of whatever monstrosity lurked outside. In the next half second, she moved with impossible speed, unzipping the tent with a single, practiced motion and slipping outside. And then the world exploded. The sound that erupted from outside was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a cacophony of primal horror, a symphony of the impossible. I'd later searched through countless wildlife recordings, desperate to categorize it, to make sense of it. It was like the mournful bugle of a bull elk, impossibly magnified, overlaid with the high-pitched, desperate shriek of a rabbit caught in a trap. And then, cutting through it all, the raw, furious scream of a mountain lion, all of it impossibly loud, impossibly close. The sound filled the night, vibrated through the ground, rattled my teeth. It was the sound of something ancient, something that hunted. Then Wendy's voice. She shouted in response, a fierce, defiant challenge. Her human voice, small and fragile in comparison, seemed to shatter against the immense, terrifying roar of the unknown. But then, as I watched, my eyes wide with disbelief and horror, her voice began to change. It deepened, warped, elongated, twisting into a sound that peeled back the layers of my sanity. It was the howl of a wolf, but a wolf the size of a bear, a sound of immense power and savage fury. My rational mind, clinging to the last vestiges of sanity, tried to deny what I was hearing, what I was seeing, but the curtain had been pulled back. I had to see. My hand, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the tent flap. I risked a peek. Standing in front of our tent, illuminated by the cold, unforgiving moonlight, was a creature ripped from the darkest corners of folklore, a werewolf. The 5-foot-something Wendy, my gentle, quiet girlfriend, now stood at least 7 feet tall, a hulking, muscled beast covered in shaggy, dark fur. Her snout was elongated, ending in powerful jaws lined with fangs that looked like polished steel. Her hands, massive and clawed, twitched with a terrifying readiness. Her eyes, glowing with that same unearthly light, were fixed on something beyond my field of vision. She looked like pure, unadulterated murder. Then movement from the opposite side of our ravaged campsite drew my attention. My gaze shifted, and my blood ran cold, turning to icy slush in my veins. The werewolf, impossibly, suddenly seemed like the lesser of two evils. It looked like a deer, but a deer twisted by starvation and malice, warped into a ghastly mockery of life. Its limbs were far too long, articulated at unnatural angles, thin and bony, like splintered stilts. Its feet ended in hooves, but its hands, if they could be called that, were long, skeletal claws. The entire body was desiccated, its skin drawn so tight over its ribs and arms that I could clearly make out the macabre landscape of its skeleton beneath. The fur was patchy, rotted in places, revealing open, weeping holes from which leaked a viscous, dark fluid that shimmered sickeningly in the moonlight. Its teeth were not just sharp, they were long, serrated blades, clearly designed for tearing flesh, not chewing cud. And its antlers. Hunters spoke of 8 points, 10 points. This thing's rack was a crown of impossible horror, at least 30 points. Each gnarled tine stained with what I could only suspect was dried viscera from past victims. It was a Wendigo. I knew it instantly, the name forming in my mind like a brand. The monster of winter, of starvation, of unending, ravenous hunger. And it was real. The two monsters charged, two forces of nature, two nightmares made flesh, hurtling towards each other with savage intent. The Wendigo, with a terrible, guttural roar, lowered its antlered head, a living spear aimed directly at Wendy's chest. But at the last second, with a speed that defied its massive size, Wendy dropped, almost flattening herself against the ground. Then, with an explosive surge of power, she rocketed upwards, twisting her body, latching onto the Wendigo's impossibly long neck with her powerful jaws. Her hind feet, tipped with those terrifying claws, raked gouges into its vulnerable stomach, tearing open the brittle flesh. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound of pure agony and rage. It bucked, thrashing violently, shaking its head with enough force to dislodge a small car. Wendy, tenacious as a pit viper, clung on, her fangs buried deep. But the Wendigo was immense, and with a final, desperate lunge, it tore free, tossing Wendy aside like a rag doll. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, a bone-jarring impact that echoed in the sudden, eerie silence. But she wasn't out. Before she could fully recover, the Wendigo was on her, its skeletal claws tearing at her. She raised an arm to defend herself, and the Wendigo, with a swift, brutal movement, latched onto it with its own horrific teeth, easily tearing through fur, skin, and muscle. A gush of dark, thick blood welled from the wound, painting her already dark fur a darker, more glistening shade. With a powerful, desperate kick, Wendy shoved the Wendigo back. It staggered, surprised, and she sprang to her feet, swiping at it with her massive claws. A flurry of savage blows that forced the nightmare creature to lose ground. But the Wendigo was relentless. Lowering its head again, it charged, a horrifying, bony battering ram. This time, Wendy wasn't fast enough. The Wendigo caught her, its antlers snagging her midsection, and with a terrible, twisting motion, it flipped her over its back. New blood, dark against the pale moonlight, stained the tips of its gnarled tines. But that was its downfall. As Wendy was flung through the air, she twisted, incredibly, impossibly, and then, with a terrifying athleticism, she sprang back onto the Wendigo's back, latching onto its neck again with her fangs, this time from behind. The Wendigo screamed, a choked, gurgling sound as she clamped down. It thrashed, its bony claws raking uselessly at her fur-covered hide. But Wendy refused to let go. I watched, my breath caught in my throat as she began to tear, rip, tear. A guttural growl rumbled from her chest as she worked, digging in, severing, until her claws found purchase on the monstrous antlers. With one final wrenching jerk, a sound like a wet tree limb snapping, the Wendigo's head came free. I won't describe what happened next. The thin nylon of the tent, my only barrier to the unimaginable, seemed to amplify every wet, tearing sound, every sickening slurp. Every wet crunch, the sound of flesh being torn and devoured, of bones being cracked and sucked dry, is a sound that will forever be seared into the deepest, most primal part of my brain. It was a symphony of the grotesque, a testament to the brutal, consuming hunger that defined this new, terrifying version of Wendy. My eyes were wide open, but I was seeing nothing, only experiencing the sounds, the cloying stench, the sheer, unimaginable horror of it all. It dragged me back to the fire, back to the sycamore grove, to the crackle and the screams, the feeling of being hunted, of being utterly, hopelessly, incomprehensibly alone in the face of something that defies all reason. That old, cold dread, the kind that had been a constant companion since childhood, solidified into an icy certainty. This was my life. This was what followed me. Time passed. An hour, 2, maybe 3. My analog watch lay forgotten in my bag, its predictable ticking a cruel joke in a world where time felt meaningless. I don't know what I expected. For the monster to turn on me? For it all to vanish like a bad dream? Eventually, the adrenaline, the raw, burning fuel that had kept me rigid, began to drain, leaving me hollowed out and trembling. My eyelids grew heavy, impossibly heavy, and despite the lingering terror, despite the profound, fundamental wrongness of everything, I fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. My body, always the survivor, had simply shut down. When I awoke in the morning, the tent was quiet, too quiet. I was alone. The sun, a pale, anemic disk in the sky, offered little comfort. My hand went to my wrist, my fingers automatically tracing the worn face of my analog watch. No, not that, not yet. I had half hoped she'd be back, curled beside me, telling me it was all just another nightmare, another rough dream, but I knew deep down that this time I wouldn't have believed her. Not again. Packing up was a lonely, surreal experience. My gear, hastily retrieved from the wreckage, felt heavy, imbued with the night's horrors. Wendy's pack, still in the tent, untouched, became a symbol of her absence. I debated taking it, a futile gesture of loyalty, but the hike back was long, and I was already exhausted, physically and spiritually. I left her things, a small, sad monument to a relationship that had warped into something truly monstrous. I crawled out of the tent, my limbs stiff, my eyes scanning the devastated campsite. The ground was churned earth, claw marks scored deep into tree trunks, dried blood splattered across leaves and rocks. It looked like a battlefield. And then I saw her, Wendy, sitting calmly by the remnants of the fire pit, cross-legged, a faint wisp of smoke curling upwards from the still warm ashes. No wounds, no blood. Her human form, pristine, perfect, terrifyingly normal. She looked up at me, her eyes holding a strange mixture of regret and resignation. She smiled sadly. So, I guess I owe you an explanation. My mind, still reeling from the night's revelations, struggled to form a coherent thought. I was empty, hollowed out. But then, the stubborn, cynical part of me, the part that always found a sarcastic comeback for every existential horror, clicked into place. What? I deadpanned, my voice hoarse. You're not going to try and convince me it was a nightmare again? Her gaze drifted around the destroyed campsite, her expression unreadable. I didn't think I could convince you this time. I nodded, the movement stiff. Yeah, I guess not. My eyes met hers. You know, for a bit there, I said, a bitter laugh bubbling up, a sound full of shock and residual fear. I was starting to think you were the monster out here eating people. Wendy pointed at herself. Then a genuine, if somewhat unhinged, laugh escaped her. It was the same bright, easy laugh I'd been so drawn to. Wait, me? Wendy the Wendigo? Don't you think that's a little too on the nose? And I couldn't help it. As weird, as messed up, as profoundly disturbing as everything was, as much as every fiber of my being screamed to run, to flee, to never look back, that was Wendy. The Wendy I knew. The Wendy I, against all logic, all reason, all survival instinct, still cared for. So, I laughed with her. A hollow, mirthless sound that nonetheless held a thread of something else. Acceptance? Fatalism? Resignation? Yeah, I admitted, looking at the remnants of our camp, the faint, lingering smell of something vile. Maybe so. Long story short, we're still together. My girlfriend might be a 7-foot-tall monster that eats other, even more terrifying monsters for fun. She might disappear into the night and return with blood on her fur, invisible to me, but palpably d'adherente. She might force me to confront the absolute, horrifying reality of the things that exist beyond the thin veil of human understanding. Things that echo the unspeakable horrors from my own buried past. The ones that still sometimes make me see flames at the edge of my vision. But dating, I've decided, is still harder. And I'm happy where I am. Or maybe I'm just too tired to run anymore. Character count, 876 characters. The shriek tore through the drywall, a sound born of agony and something ancient, something that peeled back the thin veneer of normalcy. My hands were already at my old wristwatch, fingers tracing the cool metal, a nervous tic I'd cultivated over too many sleepless nights and too many close calls. This wasn't just a domestic squabble spiraling out of control. The glass splintered, not in the apartment across the hall, but inside her head. I saw the shadow, the impossible growth pushing through bone, felt the psychic crackle in the air, and witnessed the horrifying shift from terror to something far, far worse. It had all started, as these things always did, with a bad decision dressed up as a temporary job. A way to keep moving, to keep the past just out of reach. Another city, another dead-end night shift, another layer of grime on the soul. This time, it was a low-paying security gig for a dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of what passed for a thriving metropolis these days, the kind of place where the silence was always pregnant with unseen things, where the air hung heavy with the residue of countless lives lived in quiet desperation, and where the peeling paint felt less like neglect and more like an insidious disease. I'd taken the job because it was late nights, minimal interaction, and it paid cash. The perfect setup for a ghost like me. I remember my first round on the 3rd floor, the scuff of my worn work boots on the stained carpet. The stale smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the lingering aroma of cheap microwave dinners and desperation. I was checking locks, making sure no enterprising junkie had found a new way into the laundry room. When I first heard them, voices, a man and a woman, from apartment 3B. Arguments weren't unusual in places like this, par for the course. But these voices, even muffled by a few inches of plaster and a thin door, carried an unnatural edge. The woman's voice was too soft, too pleading, and the man's, a deep baritone, occasionally fractured into something else entirely. A low growl, a guttural snarl that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I chalked it up to a bad temper, maybe a few too many beers, and kept moving. My job was to keep the residents from killing each other in the hallways, not to play marriage counselor through the walls. My conscience, a rusty, seldom used tool, remained stubbornly sheathed. A week passed. The late shift was mind-numbingly dull. My only companions were the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways, the occasional squeak of a rat in the walls, and the ever-present low hum of the building's decaying infrastructure. I'd lean against the wall in a forgotten corner, scrolling through blurry photos of dilapidated motels on my phone, already planning my next escape. Just 2 more weeks, I told myself. Just enough to fill the gas tank and stock up on enough instant coffee to keep the world at bay for another 1,000 miles. Then I was gone, another city wiped clean from my internal map. But the voices from 3B continued their nightly ritual. Not every night, but enough for me to notice. Enough for me to subconsciously alter my patrol route. Lingering a little longer on the third floor, my head tilted just so, trying to discern the nuances of the domestic drama unfolding within. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. More like the hyper-vigilance of a veteran soldier hearing distant gunfire. You don't want to get involved, but you also need to know if it's coming your way. My watch, my old analog friend, seemed heavier those nights, its ticking a stark reminder of the slow, grinding march of time. One evening, I heard a crash. The sound of breaking glass, sharp and violent, sliced through the usual hum of the building. My stomach twisted. "Don't get involved, Vance. It's not your fight." My usual mantra. But then the woman's cry, a raw, choked sob, followed by a voice, the man's, that had completely lost its human cadence. It was deeper, rougher, like rocks grinding together, laced with a venom that wasn't just anger, it was hate. A primal, consuming hate that felt older than the building, older than the city, older than me. It reminded me, vaguely, of another sound I'd heard, a whisper in a snow-choked mountain pass. Too cold, too close, from a phantom that shouldn't have been there. A shiver, colder than any winter wind, traced a path down my spine. My reluctant conscience, that festering wound in my soul, chose that moment to act up. It screamed at me. Someone is in pain. Someone needs help. I hated that voice. I'd learned, the hard way, that helping rarely ended well for Leo Vance. It just meant more scars, more trauma to add to the growing pile in my head. But the scream, it was too much. It clawed at something deep inside me, something I usually kept buried under layers of cynicism and self-preservation. Maybe it was the memory of a past failure, a person I couldn't save, a fire I couldn't stop. The details were still fuzzy, locked behind a mental block, but the feeling lingered, a constant, dull ache of guilt. I found myself outside apartment 3B. My hand hovered over the door, knuckles brushing the cold metal of the handle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drum solo of dread. The cheap wood of the door felt thin, fragile, barely a barrier. I could hear the man's voice, now a full-blown roar, punctuated by the woman's whimpers. "You think you're lonely?" he snarled, the voice somehow louder, clearer, despite the barrier. Then another crash, a heavier sound this time, something solid hitting a wall. "You know what, bitch?" My breath hitched. This wasn't just an argument, this was a demolition. And the voice, it was wrong. Too much bass, too much raw, unadulterated aggression. It wasn't just a man yelling. It was something else speaking through him. I'd seen it before, or something like it. Not like this, not exactly, but enough to know the chilling difference between human rage and something far, far worse, like the way Ethan's eyes had gone utterly dead before he started carving, or Olivia's unsettling stillness before her true nature unraveled. My internal monologue, usually so quick with a sarcastic quip, was silent, replaced by a cold dread that numbed my extremities. Your company is far from satisfying. What with your stupid goddamn rants about inequality, this injustice, that, the voice mocked, shifting now, strangely, into a patronizingly high-pitched, whining tone. It was a grotesque mimicry, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. You ever stop and think you're just making all that shit up? Or maybe things are the way they are for a reason, to keep you safe? My hand was still on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it. I couldn't. Not yet. I was a man who'd seen things that didn't fit into any sane worldview. But even I hesitated. This wasn't just a threat. It was a psychological attack, a dismantling of someone's reality. It felt intimate, violating. The woman's gasps were growing more frantic, choked, as if she were trying to hold back something enormous. something on the verge of erupting. Just how many times do I have to tell you this until it gets through your thick, fat skull? He is not your friend. The voice seethed, its words sharp as daggers, radiating a palpable sense of possession, of absolute control. All he wants from you is what every man wants from every woman, and what he wants is mine. That last word, mine, was delivered with a possessiveness that chilled me to the bone. And then, a new sound. A wet, sickening squelch. Not the sound of a fist or a body hitting a wall. It was something internal, something organic, a sound that made my stomach lurch. And with it, a faint, nauseating odor began to seep from under the door. Not human waste, not garbage. Something older, like a cellar that had been locked for centuries, filled with damp earth and something that had rotted and festered beneath it. The smell of decay, of slow, creeping corruption. My hand flew to my mouth instinctively to ward off the stench. I heard the woman's muffled yelp of pain, sharp and immediate. What the fuck? Her voice, though still choked, had changed. It had a new edge, a new resonance. And then, the male voice, the demon's voice, colder, more clinical, even as it was laced with a cruel satisfaction. What the fuck is wrong with you? That was it. The line. My reluctant conscience, having dragged me this far, finally shoved me over the edge. No more. This was beyond domestic dispute. This was something inhuman, preying on the vulnerable, and my soul, as scarred as it was, couldn't stand by. I didn't care about the consequences, about the fresh trauma. I couldn't just walk away and let whatever that thing was finish its work. Not after all I'd seen, all I'd barely survived. I gripped the doorknob. It was cold, slimy almost, though I knew it was just my clammy hand. I twisted it. The lock clicked with surprising ease. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a scene that solidified every horror I had ever witnessed, every nightmare that had ever clawed its way from my subconscious into the waking world. The apartment was a wreck. A glass lay shattered against one wall, sparkling shards scattered like malevolent diamonds on the worn carpet. A framed photograph, likely of the couple, lay face down near the doorway, its glass cover splintered. The air was thick with the cloying, putrid scent I detected, now stronger, tinged with something metallic, coppery, blood, and there they were. Daniel, the man, stood by the far wall, his face a mask of shock, eyes wide, mouth agape, seemingly transfixed by the woman on the floor. She was huddled against the base of the sofa, knees pulled tight to her chest, trembling, but it wasn't just fear that racked her. Her hands were pressed against her forehead, and between her fingers, I could see two dark, gnarled protrusions, like black branches tearing through skin. They were horns, raw, bleeding, utterly impossible. And then I saw her fingernails, elongated, yellowed, morphing into wicked claws before my very eyes. Her eyes, fixed on her transformed hands, were no longer the soft, muted color I'd imagined. They were wide, vacant, and unsettlingly white. The man, Daniel, finally stirred, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Love, what's happened to you?" And then the woman, the victim, unleashed it. Her body convulsed, a wave of raw, burning rage washing over her. The sound that ripped from her throat was not human. It was a primordial shriek, a blaring, guttural roar that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The framed photographs on the wall, already trembling, rattled violently, and one, already cracked, exploded outward, showering the room with splinters of glass. "What the fuck is wrong with me?" she screamed, her voice deepening, becoming monstrous, yet still laced with a horrifying anguish. Her entire skull seemed to contort, a fresh, sickening tearing sound accompanying the visible ripping of flesh around the base of the horns. What the fuck is wrong with me? It was a revelation, delivered with the force of a physical blow. The demon hadn't just possessed Daniel, it had created one in her, or awakened it, or perhaps it had simply been transferred. The implications made my blood run cold. Daniel, the supposed host, the one who was supposed to be the monster, recoiled, stumbling backwards, genuine terror etched on his features. He was no longer possessed, he was just a man, witnessing the horrifying transformation of the woman he claimed to love. The woman's new monstrous face turned towards me, her eyes, those vacant white orbs, locking onto mine. A flicker of something ancient and terrible burned in their depths, something that recognized me, perhaps, as another vessel of trauma, another magnet for the darkness that permeated this world. I felt a cold surge of understanding, of shared fate. "Fuck you, you fucking fuck," she yelled, her voice a chorus of pure fury and deep, shattering pain. "Just shut up, please." And then, as suddenly as it had erupted, the rage in her seemed to coil back, the horns, still black and gnarled, twisted inward, seeming to retract, though the fresh wounds continued to ooze. Her claws seemed to shrink, her eyes flickered with a returning, agonizing humanity, still white, still vacant, but no longer radiating primal fury. She collapsed onto the floor, a heap of human misery. Daniel, cautious, almost hesitant, crept towards her, perching on the edge of the mattress. His voice was soft, almost soothing, a deceptive lullaby that made my stomach churn. "No, love, you aren't a monster. You are strong, but you are damaged." His eyes, however, held a flicker of something unreadable, something calculating beneath the veneer of concern. "It looks like you have a demon, too, probably put inside you by one of those guys with their bad intentions." He sighed, pushing her bangs back, a disturbingly intimate gesture. "It's fate, love, for us to be together. I will fix you, and I will protect you from the demon inside of you. I'm the only one who understands what it's like to have one, so only I can save you from it, save you from yourself." I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my go bag slung over my shoulder, my hand still gripping the cool metal of my wristwatch, turning the crown aimlessly. The stench of rot still hung heavy in the air. The shattered glass glittered, and the words, Daniel's words, echoed in the apartment, a twisted sermon of control and manipulation. My initial surge of reluctant conscience had propelled me here, had forced me to witness this sickening display. Now, it was replaced by something far more cynical, far more weary. This wasn't just a demonic possession. This was a psychological battlefield, a twisted form of abuse cloaked in supernatural horror. Daniel wasn't just a victim. He was a manipulator, perhaps a true monster, exploiting the very real demonic presence to further his control, to convince her that she was broken and only he could fix her. He had offered her a sick parody of salvation, chaining her to him with invisible binds, far stronger than any physical restraint. And she, the victim, was now just another link in the chain, another monster in the making. The realization settled heavy in my gut. My life, my curse, had led me to witness yet another horror, another facet of the endless darkness that clung to the edges of humanity. The things I'd seen on the road, the phantom hitchhiker, Ethan's depravity, Olivia's skin collection, they were all different notes in the same terrifying symphony. People turning into monsters, or revealing the monsters that had always been lurking beneath the skin. And often, it was the normal ones, the quiet ones, the ones offering love and protection, who were the most insidious. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. I'd seen enough. My job here wasn't to intervene, not truly. It was to witness, to observe, to add another layer to the trauma that defined my existence. My fatal flaw, my reluctant conscience had gotten me in, and now my instinct for survival, honed by years of running, was screaming at me to get out. My hand tightened on my watch, the cold metal a small anchor point in the churning chaos. I turned slowly, my boots crunching softly on the glass shards near the door. I didn't look back at them, at the broken woman and the smiling devil in human skin. The air in the hallway felt suddenly lighter, cleaner, though I knew it was an illusion. The stench of rot, the echo of the screams, the image of those black, gnarled horns erupting from a human skull. They were already etched onto the walls of my mind. Another permanent fixture in the Leo Vance Chronicles. Just another ghost to keep me company on the lonely road ahead. I closed the door to apartment 3B, a quiet click that sealed away a fresh hell. My work shift wasn't over, but I knew I'd be gone by dawn. This city, like all the others, had just become too loud, too heavy, too much like home. Character count 9,876. The eyes were the worst part, not glinting with canine ferocity, but still black and utterly devoid of the warmth you'd expect from a Labrador. They fixed on the trembling scientist, not with hunger, but with something colder, something like calculation. Then, without a growl, without a single bark, the dog moved, a blur of golden fur and raw, unnatural power, a silent lunge that snapped bone and tore flesh, painting the sterile lab walls crimson. It wasn't an animal reacting to fear, it was an execution. That's how Soraya described it, tucked away in a corner of the dark web, a scream echoing in the digital void. Just another Tuesday night, another anonymous motel room, and another reason for me to clutch the worn leather of my jacket tighter, trying to outrun a past I can't quite remember and a future I don't want to see. The fluorescent hum of the motel room's ancient television was a dull thrum against the suffocating silence. Outside, the highway whined its mournful song, a ceaseless reminder of the miles I'd put behind me and the countless more stretching ahead. I was holed up in a roadside dive somewhere off I-80, the kind of place where the air conditioning sounded like a dying whale and the wallpaper peeled in surrender. Just another nameless town, another forgettable stop. My old analog wristwatch, a constant, comforting weight on my left wrist, ticked louder than it should have in the quiet. I checked it, not for the time. What was time to me anymore? But for the familiar click of the crown, a small, pointless ritual, midnight, figures. That's when the good stuff always happens, or the bad. For me, it's usually both. My laptop, a cheap, dented relic I'd picked up at a pawn shop, glowed with the sickly blue light of a deep web forum. I was supposed to be looking for freelance security gigs, the kind that pay cash and ask no questions. Instead, I'd stumbled down a rabbit hole. The post was titled "The Truth About Archie," and it reeked of paranoia, the kind I usually scrolled past. Most of it was tinfoil hat nonsense, but there was something in the ragged desperation of the words, the almost unhinged clarity, that snagged my attention. A woman named Soraya. No longer hiding, she declared. Good for her. Idiotic for her. More like, hiding was a survival skill. I'd seen enough strange things in my life, things that defied logic, things that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, things that occasionally still whispered in my nightmares, that my cynicism was less a shield and more a thick, calcified layer over a perpetually raw nerve. So then when Soraya started talking about a sly and deadly invention on the loose, I didn't dismiss it outright. My gut, that loyal, cynical bastard, just tightened. Here we go again. Another horror to add to the mental collection. She wrote of a secret government project, the kind of scientific hubris that always ends in tears and bloodshed. Geneticists, playing God, trying to create super animals. Of course, because regular animals aren't terrifying enough already, we need to juice them up with intelligence and strength. What could possibly go wrong? I imagined some lab coat wearing pencil neck explaining the project, beaming with pride. utterly blind to the cosmic irony. Humans, always reaching for the stars, always tripping over their own feet and falling into a pit of their own making. The details were chilling, told in a breathless, fragmented way, as if Soraya had typed it all in a single, terrified rush before the axe fell. Out of 1283 attempts, only 19 survived. 2 were outstanding successes. Subject 0317, codenamed Pickle, a Holland Lop rabbit with agility and fair intelligence, and Subject 0861, codenamed Archie, a Labrador retriever with great strength and intelligence. A rabbit and a dog. Sounds like a kid's cartoon, right? Except the punchline was going to be covered in blood. Archie, she wrote, with a strange emphasis. A beautiful, friendly, and obedient dog. The kind of dog you see in family photos, chasing frisbees in the park. The kind that licks your face and begs for belly rubs. That was the first prick of true dread. I looked over at Buster, curled up on the scratchy motel blanket I'd laid out for him at the foot of the bed. He was a scruffy terrier mix I'd found rooting through a dumpster behind a diner a few months back. All gangly legs and floppy ears, a rumbling freight train of snores. My one concession to anything resembling a normal life. A constant reminder of that damn reluctant conscience I couldn't seem to shake. The sight of him, innocent and trusting, made the words on the screen twist into something ugly and cold in my gut. What if? What if something like Archie existed, and you never knew until it was too late? The thought made me want to grab Buster, pull him close, just to reassure myself he was still Buster. But that would be stupid. He'd just give me a look, then go back to dreaming of squirrels. Soraya detailed the communication test. Archie and Pickle, typing on a keyboard. Archie, extroverted, typing. This again? Want to go outside? And then, the first truly unsettling line. I am 1 year old. Already. I am grown. No need protection. Need to go outside. Before demise. Demise, not death, not sleep. Demise. The word hung in the air, heavy and wrong. A year-old dog, expressing a profound awareness of its own mortality and a desire for freedom. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just a smart animal. This was something else. A flicker of something I'd once seen in a set of cold, reptilian eyes, though I couldn't quite place the memory. It was always like that with me. The brain trying to protect itself by burying the really bad stuff, but the gut remembering. Then Pickle, the rabbit, typed its own message. Important message. And then the short, horrifying warning. Apex RC. RC bad. RC attack, kill, all the... That's when it all went sideways. Archie attacked Pickle. A dog attacking a rabbit isn't unheard of, but the context, it screamed intent. The supervisors, screaming at Archie to stop, shooting tranquilizers. Archie, the beautiful, friendly, obedient dog, dodging the darts, a blur of unnatural speed. A guard tried to intervene. Archie, without a single bark, jumped, tore out the man's throat. Not a wild, desperate attack, but a precise, efficient kill. I could almost smell the coppery tang of blood, the sharp, metallic odor of fear. The sterile lab, meant to contain, becoming a slaughterhouse. Soraya, in a moment of desperate, suicidal courage, opened a door to let Pickle escape. She then slammed it shut, trapping Archie inside the test room. But the dog wasn't trapped. Not really. I imagined him, golden fur flecked with blood, standing before the push-button lock. Then, the impossible. He used it. He typed in the security code. The door hissed open. My breath hitched. Not just strong, not just intelligent, calculating, purposeful. A cold wave of dread washed over me, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your stomach clench. This wasn't just some animal gone wild. This was a mind, a strategist. My hand, almost unconsciously, went to my wristwatch, thumb tracing the glass. Click, click. A futile attempt to ground myself in reality. The red alert. Archie, ignoring everyone, walked directly to the central command room. Another passcode, another door opening with ease. The scientists inside, armed with pens and keyboards. Pens and keyboards. Against that, it was almost darkly comical, if it wasn't so utterly tragic. Archie coolly, systematically, freed the other 17 subjects. A bear, a tiger, a king cobra, pawns in his game, as Soraya later realized, designed to create chaos, to occupy the guards. Then the part that made Soraya's terror palpable even through the screen. Archie looked at them, one by one, and when he looked at her, holding pens. Plunging his eyes into mine, she wrote, it felt like he could see my soul, hear my heartbeat, and sense my overwhelming fear. Without a growl, without a bark, he attacked the closest scientist, ripping him apart. Just another obstacle, another piece of meat. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing it. The sterile white, the crimson spray, the quiet efficiency of the predator. It was the lack of sound, the absence of any animalistic rage. That was truly disturbing. This wasn't some beast running on instinct. It was a cold, calculating intelligence. It was a serial killer wrapped in a dog's skin. The sheer audacity of it, the horrifying brilliance of its plan, made my head ache. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was a fundamental violation of the natural order. A dog, man's best friend, a symbol of loyalty and innocence, turned into a silent, methodical monster. It was a grotesque inversion, a perversion of everything comforting. Buster stirred in his sleep, letting out a soft whimper, probably chasing an imaginary rabbit. I opened my eyes and looked at him again. He was so utterly, guilelessly innocent. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He was good, and yet the seed of doubt, planted by Soraya's story, had taken root. How many people had welcomed an Archie into their homes without ever knowing? How many families had patted the head of a silent, calculating killer disguised as a loyal companion? The thought made my skin crawl. It was the ultimate monster in plain sight, and it was infinitely more terrifying than the hulking, roaring kind. At least you could see those coming. Soraya went on to describe the aftermath. The bear and tiger created havoc, killed 15 people before being sedated. The cobra, found before it could reach Pickle, also sedated. Archie, the mastermind, escaped the facility after disabling cameras, slaughtering 2 cooks, a janitor, and an office administrator on his way out. People who posed no threat, just collateral damage. He wasn't killing for food or self-defense. He was killing because he could, because it was part of his escape plan, because, perhaps, he enjoyed it. The thought of that quiet, methodical slaughter made my stomach churn. The government chose silence instead of alert to avoid creating panic, she wrote. They do not want to lose their precious jewel. Typical. The bureaucracy of horror, always protecting the asset, never the people. This was why I trusted no one. Why I kept moving. Why I never stayed anywhere long enough to leave a trace. Because the monsters weren't always under the bed or in the woods. Sometimes they were walking around in plain sight, looking like the epitome of harmlessness, protected by the very people sworn to protect you. And sometimes they were born in a lab, a product of human arrogance. Her final plea was simple, desperate. Archie is a Labrador retriever, one of the most common domestic dogs in America, and he is conscious of his appearance. He looks like a normal dog and can sure act as such. If he killed your dog and replaced it, trust me, you would not know. I know Archie is still out there. Be careful. I scrolled down, looking for comments. The post was already gone, deleted. This post has been removed due to violation of community guidelines. Or more likely, because the government, with its long, silent reach, had found Soraya. Maybe she was erased like she feared. A cold, hard knot formed in my chest. So much for no longer hiding. I leaned back in the motel chair, the cheap plastic creaking under my weight. My eyes drifted to Buster again, who let out a contented sigh. He was harmless. He was mine. And the thought that something like Archie could be out there, could replace him, could walk into my life dressed in fur and innocence. It was a new kind of terror, one that burrowed deep into the space that Buster had finally started to fill. The vulnerability of it was almost unbearable. My fatal flaw, that damn conscience, had led me to open my life, just a crack. And now the world was showing me exactly how that could backfire. I ran a hand over the worn leather of my jacket, the familiar texture, a small comfort. It was a damn good thing I didn't stay put for long, because if Archie was out there, blending in, playing the perfect family pet, then every wagging tail was a potential lie, every friendly bark a concealed threat. The world was already a minefield of unseen horrors, things that clawed at the edges of reality. But this was the horror of the mundane, of the everyday. It made the familiar alien, the safe, dangerous. It confirmed every cynical suspicion I'd ever had. I reached for my go bag, the one that was always packed, always near the door, checked the Maglight's batteries, made sure the cash was there, just in case, because even though I was miles away from any secret government lab, and Archie was just a story on a deleted forum, the seed of that particular nightmare had been planted. And in my world, nightmares had a nasty habit of growing teeth. I looked at Buster one last time. He shifted, nestled deeper into the blanket. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if anything ever threatened him, if anything ever tried to wear his skin or steal his place, my reluctant conscience wouldn't be so reluctant. It would be a fury. And that, I knew, was a far more dangerous weakness than anything else. Total character count, 9877. The scream, when it finally tore through the kitchen, was less a sound and more a physical rupture in the fabric of the night. It was the raw, wet shriek of a man realizing too late that his body was being repurposed, that the world was a slaughterhouse disguised as a five-star dining experience. My blood ran cold, a familiar, unwelcome guest coiling in my gut. This wasn't the first time I'd heard a sound like that, a sound that spoke of flesh tearing and sanity unraveling. But something about its desperate finality, its sudden, guttural stop, told me this horror was of a different vintage, a bespoke atrocity tailored just for Carparelli's discerning clientele. And for me, it was just another Tuesday night, another stain on the soul, another reason to keep moving, to never stay in one place long enough for the shadows to truly settle. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the industrial dishwasher, the incessant thrum of the restaurant's hidden machinery, all of it faded into a dull drone beneath the ringing echo of that dying scream, a siren song for the damned. I closed my eyes for a split second, seeing not the mundane gleam of stainless steel, but the ghostly outlines of countless horrors I'd collected, like souvenirs of the abyss, each one whispering the same cynical truth. You're never truly safe. Vance, not from them, not from yourself. My hand, slick with grease and dishwater, instinctively went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the worn metal of my old analog watch. A useless habit in a world where time had ceased to make any goddamn sense at all. It was a grounding ritual, a desperate plea for something, anything, to remain constant in the face of the encroaching madness. But even the watch felt heavier now, colder, as if it too had absorbed the chill radiating from the sound of a man being vivisected just a few yards away, behind a closed door. The kind of door that, in my experience, usually led to nothing but pain. Funny how a single sound can rearrange your entire reality. Just a few hours before, my biggest concern was the pile of greasy platters that seemed to multiply faster than I could scrub them clean. This was Carparelli's. After all, a monument to excess where the rich came to validate their existence, and I came to earn enough cash to vanish again for a few months. It was a job like any other. Another temporary anchor in a life built on impermanence. A place where the worst thing I expected to find was a stubborn clump of risotto. I was wrong. I was always wrong. I'd been at Carparelli's for just over a year, long enough for the novelty of washing the city's most expensive dinnerware to wear off, but not long enough to actually put down roots. That was the point. Of course, no roots, no expectations, no attachments, just the rhythm of the work. Scrub, rinse, stack, repeat. The roar of the sprayer, the sizzle of hot water on cold porcelain, the clatter of cutlery. It was a monotonous symphony, loud enough to drown out most of the noise in my head, which suited me just fine. My worn leather jacket hung on a hook by the staff entrance, a familiar scent of stale cigarettes and road dust clinging to its seams, waiting for the moment I'd shrug it on and disappear into the night again. Carparelli's was one of those places that people booked months in advance, where the average dinner cost more than my weekly pay, and the clientele probably had names that were also tax shelters. I rarely saw them, stuck as I was in the humid, clangorous purgatory of the dish pit, but there was a small, grimy window in the kitchen that offered a sliver of a view into the dining area. When I stacked the clean plates, I'd sometimes catch a glimpse, a sea of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, diamond necklaces glittering under the soft amber light, top hats, even, and the gloves, always the gloves, so many of them, pristine white or polished black leather, covering the hands that held the forks that fed the mouths that came to Carparelli's for an experience. I'd always found it a bit theatrical, a little too much pomp for a meal, but who was I to judge the eccentricities of the elite? I was just the guy who cleaned up after their opulent messes. The pay was good, surprisingly good for a job that mostly involved getting soaked to the bone and smelling faintly of stale food. It kept my go bag perpetually topped up with emergency cash and protein bars, kept Buster fed when he was with me, and kept me from having to think too hard about where I was or where I was going. Just enough to move, always enough to move. I got along with the line cooks well enough, a motley crew of stressed out, perpetually sweating individuals who communicated mostly in grunts and profanity. But the head chef, the enigmatic figure everyone simply called Chef, was another story. He wasn't the screaming, pan-throwing type I'd expected. No Gordon Ramsay theatrics here. Chef was quiet, almost unnervingly calm. He moved through the kitchen like a ghost. His presence felt more than seen, his voice a low, even murmur that cut through the chaos without ever rising above a conversational tone. It was unsettling, too composed, too much control, like a predator observing its prey, unhurried, knowing. I'd learned to trust the loud ones, the ones whose anger was right on the surface. It was the quiet ones, the ones with secrets, who made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Chef's biggest secret was his special meal. It was the main draw, a dish so exclusive it had to be ordered days in advance. A culinary myth cooked only by him, in a private, soundproofed room at the very back of the kitchen. The door to that room was always, without fail, closed, locked. I suspected no one, not even his most trusted sous chefs, knew what went on in there. No one knew the ingredients, the process, the magic. It felt less like a kitchen and more like an operating theater, or perhaps a confessional for culinary sins. I'd seen him disappear into it countless times, sometimes carrying odd-shaped packages wrapped in butcher paper, other times just slipping in, empty-handed, leaving only a lingering scent that wasn't quite spices, wasn't quite meat, but something sharper, metallic, like a fresh cut. Last night, my shift began like any other. 6 p.m. The dinner rush was still an hour off, so I started on the prep dishes, the mountains of pots, pans, and mixing bowls left by the morning and afternoon crews. My hands worked on autopilot, scrubbing away the remnants of sauces, char, and God knows what else. It was mindless, meditative work, exactly what I sought. The hours melted away, marked only by the escalating clatter and the growing aroma of roasted meats and garlic from the main kitchen. Around 6:30 p.m., the first wave of dinner plates began to arrive, scraped clean, mostly by the waitstaff, piled onto trolleys and wheeled into my domain. Tonight, there was a new kid on the floor, fresh-faced and perpetually flustered. I watched him through the small kitchen window, tripping over his own feet, trying to navigate the intricate dance of a high-end dining room. Rookie mistake, I thought, when I grabbed the first stack of customer plates and felt a distinct lump on one of them. Waiters were supposed to pre-scrape everything before it hit the dish pit. This kid clearly hadn't. I sighed, a resigned murmur. Just my luck, always something extra. I picked up the heavy stack, the ceramic cold and slick against my forearms, and lowered them into the sink, already half filled with steaming, soapy water. They clunked gently against the metal bottom, submerging with a soft gurgle. The water immediately grew cloudy, tinged with the faint sheen of forgotten sauces. I started with the top plate, scrubbing vigorously with a bristled brush, then slid it onto the plastic rack that would go into the monstrous, steam-belching dishwasher. I repeated the process. Another plate, another. Then I felt it. Something soft, yet distinctly solid, brushing against my hand as I moved the plates around. Must be that lump of food the new kid missed. I grumbled internally. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythmic motion of my scrubbing, but it was insistent, bumping against my knuckles, then gliding along my palm. It felt odd, not like a piece of bread or a chunk of meat. It was longer, firmer, almost cylindrical, too firm for old food. Maybe some kind of odd utensil, I mused, my brow furrowing. But no, the texture was wrong, too yielding, yet with an inner resilience that felt disturbingly familiar. Somehow, it brushed against my fingers again, a wet, slick contact that made my stomach churn with a vague, formless dread. This time, I paid closer attention. It wasn't just long, it had a distinct, segmented feel. And then, at one end, a surprising hardness, a nail, a fingernail. My breath hitched. It was a stupid thought, a crazy thought, but it was there, nagging at the back of my mind. Against every instinct that screamed at me to leave it alone, to just let it wash down the drain and pretend I hadn't felt anything. My reluctant conscience kicked in. What if it's something important? What if it's a piece of something vital? And, more selfishly, what if it clogs the drain and I have to reach in and clear it later? Better to get it now. The thought was a weak excuse, a thin veneer over a deeper, more troubling curiosity. I took a deep, shaky breath, the humid kitchen air feeling suddenly thick and cloying in my lungs. My fingers, pruny from the hot water, delved back into the murky depths, searching. They closed around the object. It was undeniably elongated, disturbingly organic in its firmness. And yes, at one end, there was indeed a small, hard, convex surface, a nail. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against bone. I pulled my hand out of the water. The strange object clutched tightly, dripping. The light from the overhead fluorescence glinted off the water, off my wet, trembling fingers. And then I saw it, the nail, the pale, wrinkled skin surrounding it, the ridged knuckle, and the raw, bloody, jagged tear at the base. It wasn't a piece of food. It wasn't a utensil. It wasn't even a full finger. It was an index finger, severed from a hand, clearly, messily, violently. A stump of raw flesh where it had been torn away, still weeping a few thin rivulets of dark, almost black, blood into the dishwater. The skin, though submerged, was already taking on that waxy, waterlogged look of something that has been dead too long. A guttural sound tore from my throat, a choked gasp of pure, unadulterated revulsion. It wasn't a scream exactly. Not yet, but a raw, animal noise of disgust and horror. My grip faltered. The finger, slick with water and what little blood remained, slipped from my fingers and plopped back into the murky sink with an obscene splotch, disappearing beneath the floating suds. "What the hell was that, Vance?" Chef's voice cut through the suddenly ringing silence. His tone sharp, his presence unnervingly close behind me. I hadn't even heard him approach. My stomach heaved, threatening to empty its contents onto the pristine tile floor. "There's something in the sink," I choked out, my voice thin, reedy, barely my own. My throat felt constricted, like I'd swallowed a handful of sand. It's a finger, a human finger. Even I could hear the fear in my voice, the frantic edge of disbelief. Chef let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, as if I'd just announced a minor inconvenience, like a clogged drain. "A human finger. Vance, are you quite sure? You've been working too many late nights. Probably just a piece of, well, something else. There's no way there's a human finger in there." His voice was smooth, calm, entirely too reassuring. It had the same quality as a doctor delivering bad news with a comforting smile. Only this time, the doctor was a chef, and the news was that a piece of someone was floating in my workplace. Before I could protest, before I could articulate the sheer, horrifying certainty of what I'd just seen, Chef plunged his hand into the water, a stark white chef's sleeve disappearing into the cloudy suds. He fished around for a moment, then pulled his hand out, a small, pale object clutched between his thumb and forefinger. The water streamed off it, revealing it with horrifying clarity. The index finger, still dripping, still with the raw, ragged edge. Chef looked at it. His expression, usually so impassive, shifted, just a flicker. A brief tightening around the eyes, a slight clenching of his jaw. But it was there. He recognized it. He knew exactly what it was. For a terrifying second, I thought he might blanch, might finally react with the horror this situation deserved. But then, just as quickly, the mask of calm resettled. He looked up at me, his eyes disturbingly flat, almost bored. "Oh," he said, his voice as casual as if he'd just found a stray pea in a bowl of mashed potatoes. "That's not supposed to be in there." And with that, he turned, still holding the severed digit, and walked away. Just like that. No questions, no alarm, no hint of a plan, just a mild, almost apologetic dismissal. "Not supposed to be in there." The words echoed in my head, a perverse mantra. No shit. Sherlock. It's supposed to be attached to a person, a living person, preferably. The casualness of it was what truly sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just that he wasn't reacting like a normal human being. It was that his reaction implied a context I couldn't even begin to fathom. Where was it supposed to be then? Was there a designated place for discarded human appendages at Carparelli's? Was this a regular occurrence? The thought curdled my insides. I watched him go, a macabre Pied Piper leading a severed finger through the bustling kitchen. He moved with an odd stealth, subtly trying to conceal the finger in his hand as he passed by the other cooks, who were too engrossed in their own furious dance of sizzling pans and shouted orders to notice. He disappeared around the corner, heading in the direction of his private, soundproofed sanctum, the secret room where he conjured his exclusive special meal. The door hissed shut behind him. He reappeared barely a minute later, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel, his face once again a picture of serene, almost unsettling, calm. He moved back to his station, picking up a glistening chef's knife, beginning to slice something with unnerving precision, as if he hadn't just handled a dismembered body part. The whole thing felt like a particularly twisted dream, a scene from a bad horror movie I desperately wanted to wake up from. But the lingering, metallic tang in the air, the nausea churning in my gut, confirmed its horrifying reality. "This is a police matter," My mind screamed, "An ambulance! Somebody!" But Chef was acting as if he'd merely retrieved a dropped spoon, or worse, as if this was normal. A routine mishap in the high-stakes world of fine dining. I knew the finger had come in on one of the customers' dirty plates. Did that mean one of the patrons was currently bleeding out in the dining room? Missing a digit? And if so, why was there no commotion out front? No screams? No sirens? Why the hell was everything so quiet? Chef must have felt my unwavering gaze, because he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were devoid of emotion, like polished stone. Then he started walking toward me, a slow, deliberate stride that felt predatory, like a shark circling. My breath hitched. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to bolt through the nearest exit and never look back. But the reluctant conscience, that festering flaw that always got me into trouble, held me rooted to the spot. I needed answers. Or maybe I just needed to know if I was going completely insane. "Is the person who lost the finger? Are they all right?" I stammered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Shouldn't we call the police? Or an ambulance? Or anybody?" My voice was barely a whisper. Chef stopped just a few feet from me, close enough for me to smell the faint, oddly sweet scent that seemed to cling to him. He smiled then, a small, humorless curve of his lips. "Don't you worry, Vance. It's being taken care of. The customer is quite all right. A minor mishap. The matter is being dealt with internally." His eyes held mine, a silent, chilling warning in their depth. But I understand. It can be traumatic to find such things. "Why don't you take a short break? Go sit down in the staff lounge. Clear your head." My head was anything but clear. It was a whirlwind of nausea and disbelief. Every fiber of my being screamed that nothing about this was all right, and nothing was being taken care of. But the offer of a break, of a chance to escape the infernal heat and the smell of stale blood, was too tempting. I nodded, numbly, and walked away, my legs feeling like lead. The staff lounge was a cramped, windowless box, smelling of stale coffee and unwashed uniforms. I sank onto a worn couch, my mind racing. No police, no ambulance, no questions. This wasn't how things worked. People don't just lose fingers and then have the matter dealt with internally by a chef who acts like he's misfiled a receipt. This wasn't normal, none of it. A cold dread, far deeper than the initial shock, began to settle in my bones. I couldn't stay. There was no way I could finish my shift. I had to get out. Every second I remained in Carparelli's felt like a second closer to becoming another minor mishap. I pushed myself off the couch, my muscles protesting, and headed back toward the kitchen, my resolve hardening with every step. I'd tell Chef I was leaving, and then I'd walk out, disappear into the night, and never look back. This was exactly why I kept moving, to escape the moments when the normal world revealed its monstrous underbelly. As I approached the kitchen, a low murmur of voices reached my ears. They were coming from Chef's private room, the one with the perpetually closed door. My footsteps slowed. My hand instinctively went to my wrist again, tracing the cold metal of my watch, a useless tick in a moment that stretched into an eternity. The voices were muffled, distorted by the thick door, but as I drew closer, leaning in, I could start to distinguish words, snippets of a desperate conversation. "Please, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to leave it sitting on the plate. I'm not sure how it happened, but I promise it will not happen again." The voice was high-pitched, trembling, laced with abject terror. It was the new waiter. I recognized his shaky cadence. He was begging. A different voice, low and resonant, cut him off. Chef's voice. "No, you're right. It won't happen again." There was an unnerving calm in his tone, a cold promise that sent chills down my spine. "But that doesn't solve the dilemma we are facing. Someone has paid for the chef's special, and you know the rules. One man's payment becomes another man's meal. I needed that finger for the customer who ordered my special. Do you really think I can serve that after it has been sitting in a sink, stewing in dishwater? A wave of nausea crashed over me, stronger this time, almost buckling my knees. Payment? Meal? My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the words, to piece together the unspeakable implications. No, I know you can't serve it now, the waiter whimpered, his voice thick with tears. The absolute despair in his tone was palpable, a chilling echo of his deepest fears. He knew. He understood. And whatever he understood, it was pure, unadulterated horror. No, I can't! Chef's voice grew colder, a razor-sharp edge of irritation now discernible beneath the calm. But the customer has already paid, and we can't make him pay again. So, I will have to get the ingredient from another source. No, please, I will find you another. Please, anything but this. The waiter's plea was a strangled sob, a desperate, animalistic cry for mercy. He was utterly broken, reduced to a desperate, pitiful wheeze. Then came the scream. It wasn't a whimper, or a sob, or a plea. It was a single, piercing shriek of pure, agonizing pain, cut off abruptly, as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth, or a throat had been severed. Sound was muffled by the thick door, but standing there, my ear pressed against the cold metal. It was clear, too clear. It was the sound of flesh tearing, of bone grinding, of a life being violently, horribly extinguished. The sound of a human body being harvested. Another source. The words slammed into me, finally making a horrifying, sickening sense. My flight response, a finely honed instinct cultivated over years of running from things that defied explanation, kicked in with a vengeance. My legs moved before my brain could even process the command. I didn't think. I didn't pause. I didn't try to reason. I just ran. Through the bustling kitchen, past the wide-eyed line cooks who seemed to shrink back from my wild, desperate flight. I didn't care. I didn't look back. The heat, the smells, the noise, it all blurred into an oppressive wall, and I pushed through it, gasping for breath, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I burst through a side door, out into the cool, blessed night air, not slowing until I was halfway across the alley, my lungs burning. But before I cleared the kitchen, before I truly escaped the gilded nightmare that was Carparelli's, my gaze flickered, drawn by some morbid compulsion, to the small, grimy window that offered a view into the main dining area. The first thing I saw was a large table, bathed in the soft, intimate glow of the chandeliers. A group of men, dressed in impeccable tuxedos, their faces serene, almost rapturous, were raising their wine glasses in a silent toast. And then I saw their hands, the gloves. I realized with a fresh wave of nausea, were gone. And every man at that table was missing something. On one hand, each of them, from the pinky to the thumb, every single finger had been neatly, surgically removed. The stumps, raw and red, were stark against their starched white cuffs, ghastly monuments to some unspeakable, horrifying appetite. My gut lurched. The nausea, which had been a dull throb, became an overwhelming, violent surge. I turned away, stumbling blindly into the oppressive darkness of the alley, my mind reeling, my vision swimming. The elegant, exclusive Carparellis, the secret room, the chef's special meal, the missing fingers, the payment, the another source. It all clicked into place, a monstrous jigsaw puzzle of human depravity and unspeakable horror. The rich and fancy. They didn't just come to Carparelli's for a meal. They came for a specific, gruesome delicacy, and they paid for it, not with money, but with pieces of themselves. and then they consumed pieces of others. The thought was so profoundly, viscerally disgusting, so utterly vile, that it threatened to shatter the fragile shield of cynicism I had carefully constructed over the years. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a human abattoir disguised as a temple of haute cuisine. Another stain, another scar, another reminder that the true monsters didn't lurk in the shadows. They wore tuxedos. My hand instinctively went to my worn leather jacket, pulling it tighter around me, as if it could somehow ward off the lingering chill of the night, the pervasive horror that now clung to my skin like an invisible shroud. I pulled out my keys, fumbling with the lock on the passenger side of my beat-up pickup truck. Buster, my scruffy companion, was waiting inside, curled up on the seat, his familiar presence a small, flickering flame in the encroaching darkness. I needed to get in, get out, and drive until the memory of Car Pirellis and the things that went on behind its closed doors faded into the rearview mirror. But I knew with the weary certainty of a man who had seen too much that some things never truly fade. They just burrow deeper, waiting for the next moment of quiet, the next stretch of lonely road, to remind you that the world was still, irrevocably broken. Character count 9, 7, and 88.